long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Conservator Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by the wasp nest of my life. It's Mr. Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Gotcha. You stuck your hand right in there, and I stung you.
And then I thought I killed you, but then, psych, you're back.
I just keep coming back.
This week on the show, The Shining continues with chapters 14 through 18 as part 3, The Wasp's Nest, begins. Life at the Overlook also begins. And so far, everything is fine. I mean, except for the part where Jack blames everyone else for his problems and then almost falls off a roof and gives his son a wasp nest that ends up coming back to life and stinging the shit out of him. Okay, at least the play is going well.
Yeah, just a couple things went wrong. And really, things go wrong all the time, right? Doesn't mean anything.
That is true. Matt, what did you think of this week's reading?
This is really interesting stuff, particularly as it pertains to nuances of Jack's character that I really didn't anticipate. Didn't see this stuff coming. Revelations, and I'm going to have a lot to say this week about how King sequences the information that he gives you. And I think this is kind of a characteristic Stephen King thing, really, but this is like the most fun example of it that I can think of. And then there's just a bunch of great scenes this week, really. Like there's just a bunch of classic scenes. It's going to be fun to talk about each of them.
It is really. I mean, this is actually, looking at page numbers wise, the longest reading of our time with The Shining. This is 97 pages long. It's just kind of the way the chapter breakdown happened that I had to make this one a little bit longer. And last week's was a little bit shorter. I could have cut the final chapter out of last week's or cut a chapter out of this week's and put it in last week's, but then we would have started a new part. And that would have just been weird. So this is the longest by far, and there's so much going on here. There's so much to talk about. I can't wait. I think this is I am absolutely in love with this book, Matt. And I read it, not too long ago, and I really enjoyed it then. But man, just getting into this, opening up this, especially this first chapter we're going to cover, just really, really, really great Jack stuff. I mean, King at the top of his game here with the character work he's doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, whatever I was expecting, this book is exceeding my expectations.
And there hasn't really even been a spooky yet, Matt. We're 3 weeks in. There's been kind of hints and gestures towards spookies.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes knowing what I know about the story, I will think to myself oh, this is the hotel. And I'm like, no, there's none of that textually present. It could very well just be nothing.
Yeah,
or just a coincidence or just bad luck or whatever. So
could be, probably isn't.
I mean, what's funny is I don't know if the book ever says, turns and looks at the camera and says the wasp nest was magical. But what if it wasn't? What if Jack's just really bad at implementing bug bombs? It's entirely possible, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly true. That is very possible. I don't think so, but but that's very possible. Yeah. All right. Let's get into it, Matt, and begin at the beginning with chapter 14, titled "Up on the Roof." And I think we talked about this in the intro, but this might be just one of my favorite chapters in the book, definitely so far, and maybe in the book as a whole. I love everything we're doing here. I love this really deep dive examination of Jack Torrance. This very illuminating deep dive. And we kind of begin with Jack being stung by a wasp from a nest he's inadvertently exposed while repairing the Overlook's west roof. And before we go on here, Matt, I just wanted to say, maybe this is a people in the 1970s knew how to do more things thing. But if someone asked me to go repair a roof, I would be I don't know how to do that. Can you teach me how to do that?
What if it was the roof of an entire hotel and not just a small section? Would that make it easier for you? Oh, no, the opposite?
70 feet off the ground. Yeah.
It would be funny if Ullman gets back and he's like, dude, what the hell? I didn't ask you to do that. We were going to have a professional roofing crew come in and do that next month. I already paid them. And you did a horrible job. It's going to cost extra to redo it. I'm taking it out of your pay, Jack.
I bet that is exactly what would happen. If well, we'll get there.
We'll get there.
I think, I do think the book like puts some groundwork in this, that Jack, did some construction work, I think, earlier in his career as he was trying to like make ends meet, putting himself through college type stuff. So I guess maybe there's like a one note to this, but like I don't know, the book just keeps like treats this as like really casual, like, yeah, you just go up on the roof and you take off the one shingle,
Yeah.
and then you put down the new shingle, and
Yeah.
then there's roof up there.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm bored, I just go reshingle my roof. I don't know about you.
Well, anyway, he's stung by a wasp, and we learn that they've been here at the Overlook for 3 weeks, and Jack is just he's just having a wonderful time. The text describes this as golden day after golden day, and all that ominousness that we left last week appears to be gone. We learn that Jack is writing again, and that the play is going really, really well for the first time in years. He's actually making progress, and he's so optimistic that he thinks he's going to be done by New Year's. So it's great, Matt. It's all going great.
Yeah, the hotel is love bombing them at this stage prior to the narcissistic assault. No, I mean, see, I don't even know if I'm joking or not, because like, I don't want to start blaming everything that happens on the hotel when, like I just said, if I were reading this in a vacuum, I would have no idea that there was the hotel at this point, So it's just, I don't know how to approach it critically. I guess I'll just approach it genuinely and just say what I'm thinking, which is how I always do. But like it is surprising to me. I'll say it this way: it's surprising to me how long it is taking for us to even get the slightest hint that there is the hotel.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think I do appreciate how the hotel is barely a character so far, and as we know, it kind of will become one eventually. But I think this is just the kind of the high of this new location, this new thing that is kind of rubbing off on all our characters. And it's funny because I really have this distinct memory of reading this book for the very first time when I was there's many moons ago, when I was much younger, and I really believed the first time I was reading this book that this is a story about a guy who went through some tough times, is on a road to recovery, and then events at the hotel happen and kind of throw him back into this spiral. But man, when I revisited this book a few years ago, and then of course again now for this, it's really shocking to me just how fucked Jack Torrance is from the get-go. I mean, everything in this chapter I think serves to make it absolutely clear that this guy is doing the wrong things and is kind of setting himself up for failure here.
Yeah, he has totally the wrong mindset, and even though things are externally better, they're not internally better. I'm really in love with how King sequences the reveals of information for us throughout the whole book, and then particularly here, because there's been this fantastic push and pull of causing us to understand and empathize with Jack, and think kind of like what you were just saying, where it's like, oh, he's not a bad guy, he's really on the right track, and then King will reveal some new truth that he's been withholding that pushes us away from Jack again. But then he's always going to pull us back in again, though. And I mean, it's funny because last week I kind of worried. I think I even said something along these lines to you. I was like, I'm worried we're being unfair to Jack, which is of course our usual habit. But this week's reading makes it clear, like, no, we're not. Like, King really wants us to feel certain negative feelings toward our main character here.
Yeah, and it's great because he hasn't done anything yet, right? I mean, at least in the recent past, he hasn't done anything. These are just the internal thoughts that we're seeing here, but they are so illuminating us to this guy's state of mind, the way he approaches problems, the way he's going to react to in crisis situations, that it's just like, oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So first, in this, King finally lets us on to what this play of Jack's is all about. We've been talking about this play over and over again, and we finally get to learn what it's about. It's called The Little School, and in it, there's the basic conflict of the story is a student Denker, who's a gifted student who had failed into becoming the brutal and brutalizing headmaster of a turn-of-the-century New England prep school, and the younger Gary Benson, the student he sees as a younger version of himself. And this is hilarious because we're setting up this dynamic, right? Where we have Denker, the asshole headmaster, and Gary Benson, the young gifted student, and you just know Jack sees himself as the Benson character, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's writing this play and he's like, yes, the gifted, hopeful youth, and he sees himself as that. But sure, yeah. Jack, that's you.
He wants to see himself as that. Yeah, it's the perfect framing. Like, this sort of thing right here is the kind of minor genius that I never would have noticed if I had read this book like 10 years ago before we had done all this talking about books. Because King, like, what he's doing with the idea of the play here is he's setting up the structure of what we are going to do with Jack this week. We're establishing this hint that Jack really profoundly resents the fact that he's no longer the young, hot, desirable, up-and-coming, destined for success stud that he used to be. In fact, he's closer to being the washed-up, midlife failure. Which again, he's the one who's structuring these mental icons, not me. And he's in extraordinary denial about this fact. But we see it leaking out around the edges in all these different ways. It's in the art he creates. It's in the story of how he lost his temper and got fired. And I just think it's great how we come away from this chapter totally understanding all of this, but Jack doesn't understand it. And we're entirely in his head. Isn't that just amazing sleight of hand from a writing perspective?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and we can't underestimate like how hard this actually is to do, because you have to craft a character who is in total denial and is gesturing towards the things he really feels but can't ever outright say them. And you have to do it in this book. One of the things we talked about with King is the places he does and doesn't use like narrator voice. And this is a book so far, I think you might agree, that is very, very sparse on actual narrator voice. Like when we are being narrated in the story, it is almost always via the perspective of whichever character's head we're in at the moment. Yes. There is no kind of removed voice that's over it all. So he has to do all this, King does, with that in mind, just with the central frame of mind of the actual character he's in. And so he can't just come out and tell us that, oh no, this is what Jack is really thinking. This is the insecurities. And he does it, you're absolutely right, through these brilliant structural conceits, through the play, through the repetition of the use of the timer and the reveal that Jack is lying to himself. Like all throughout this chapter, just mixing these beautiful things that demonstrate to you, the reader, this is what's really going on. And this is exactly why you should be worried about this guy.
Yeah. I mean, you said just a second ago, this is like your favorite chapter in the book so far. And I'm like, yeah, I think I agree. And what's funny is what happens in this chapter. A guy sits on a roof and he gets stung, and then he ruminates. And it's just this incredibly internal ruminative chapter. Yeah. Which nonetheless is awesome. Like, this is this sort of thing is my favorite thing that Stephen King does, where it's just like this winding labyrinth of a person's interiority. Yeah. I tweeted something the other day. I was like, The Shining is far too interior of a novel to ever be adapted to the screen. Which, get the joke, obviously, but it really is. It's such an interior novel that it's kind of surprising that it works. I mean, obviously we haven't got to the action part yet, but like the meat of it so far to me is all of this winding interiority and internal turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, you not to do the thing I said explicitly last week I didn't want to do, but you kind of get why Kubrick looked at this thing and said, we got to just make this guy a monster. Like, there's no way visually we can depict the complicated shit that's going on inside his head. It's so much easier if we just make him the monster and then make the movie about that fact playing out.
Right. Yep.
So as Jack is up on the roof looking at the wasp nest, he's thinking about the past few years, and he comes to a very important realization, Matt, the most important realization. None of this is my fault, actually. He says here, he now thought that part of his drinking problem had stemmed from an unconscious desire to be free of Stovington and the security he felt and the security he felt was stifling whatever creative urge he had. He had stopped drinking, but the need to be free had been just as great. Hence, George Hatfield. Just
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. I didn't get fired for beating up a kid. I subconsciously wanted to quit. And so I beat up the student on purpose so I could get fired. Yeah.
I mean,
That's
checks
good.
out, man. Totally checks out.
I love it.
So Jack describes himself as a passive character in his life. He's ruled over by things he had no control of. He compares alcoholism. He compares breaking your son's arm. He compares beating up a 17-year-old boy as just sticking his hand into a wasp's nest, which is sure.
Yeah. Whatever you got to tell yourself. Yeah. No, I mean, you stir into this idea of stir into this the idea of losing your temper as something that happens to you.
Yeah.
That you have no control over, and you've got a real insidious monster in the making.
Yeah, definitely. We do learn, though, that Jack has a less than great childhood. That's one thing that the book had not shown us yet. We learn that he had an abusive father. We don't get a lot of detail of it, but just basic, he lays it out matter-of-factly that his dad would physically abuse him quite often. And this caused him to kind of approach all situations with lashing out physically as well. He just would get in a lot of fights as a kid. He went out for the football team and used that as a kind of an outlet. But still to Jack, all this stuff is just more waspness stuff. And he says here, just wonderful writing. When you unwittingly stuck your hand into the wasp nest, you hadn't made a covenant with the devil to give up your civilized self with its trappings of love and respect and honor. It just happened to you. Passively, with no say, you ceased to be a creature of the mind and became a creature of nerve endings, from college-educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. So, I mean, I think, if you can't tell by the immense sarcasm with which we've been treating all of this, I kind of think this is all a bunch of bullshit. And I think King really wants you to feel that this is all a bunch of bullshit. I mean, like, it's true that alcoholism is this disease that, like, it's not a thing you ask for, right? It's not a thing you wake up and say, I'm going to become an alcoholic today. It's just a thing that you have. That's true, but that doesn't mean that you're devoid of any responsibility for your actions because of it,
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we have the cheat sheet of the character of Father Callahan from all of the other books, and so we see a lot more of King's thoughts on this beyond just this book. And I mean, I feel pretty confident that at least latter day King would never say making the right choice is easy, right? Whether it comes to alcoholism or not hitting your kids when they spill milk on your laptop or whatever, like, it's not easy to do the right thing. But I also don't think he would say, like, the difficulty or the unfairness of your situation absolves you of the moral imperative to make the right choice, regardless of whether it's easy. Life isn't fair. Life is hard. And you're still expected to do the hard thing, even though it's not fair. I think King's villains typically do wallow in the wrongs that have been done to them as a way of justifying their self-indulgent behaviors. So like, really, honestly, Jack is behaving as a classic King villain here. So
yeah, no, you're so right. And that isn't to say that, like, it's okay. Like, it's awful that he got beat up as a kid, right? It's awful that he had an abusive asshole of a father. It's awful that he has this disease that he didn't ask for and he has to work his way through it. That's awful, and it's not fair. It's not fair at all. But, like, his ability to just kind of, in this moment, just say, you know what? That's not my fault, though. And it's not me. It's not my fault. I'm a passive creature in my life, and to kind of brush it off and, I guess, make himself feel better about the actions that he did because it wasn't his fault gosh, just terrifying.
Yeah.
So from here, Jack finally tells the full story of George Hatfield, the 17-year-old kid that he beat up. We learn that George was a likable, articulate jock who went out for the debate team, probably for some extracurricular credits. And George was, it turns out, great at debate too. He prepped really well. He knew his stuff. He knew how to form arguments. He just had one small problem, Matt. whenever he got up there to talk, for some reason he would start to stutter. He just stuttered, and we didn't know why.
Scott, are we going to find out that Jack stuttered as a child? Are we going to find that out?
I don't think it's my job to tell you what we're gonna find out.
Well, I'm saying that now for the record because it just makes too much sense. But anyway, yeah.
So the first incident Jack tells us about is when George confronts him after class, accusing him of moving the timer ahead on his time to debate and not giving him the full 5 minutes he was deserving. Jack, of course, denies this, but as the chapter wonderfully reveals, this is another bit about the brilliant structure of how King doles out this information. There's a 3-beat throughout the rest of the chapter from here on out where we learn that Jack did indeed set the timer ahead. It starts out wonderfully with him denying it outright. He denies it right to George and denies it to himself in this moment. Then he says it again, but this time he says, I didn't set the timer ahead. He was quite sure of it. And then our 3rd beat of this thing is the reveal that he did, but it was only by a minute or so, and it was only out of pity because the poor boy was struggling and he pitied him.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's so wonderful.
Yeah.
And it basically allows us to see that Jack is just like, if we had any doubts about whether Jack was being sincere in any of the other stuff he's saying, this makes it clear, right? He's made entirely of bullshit.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was absolutely wild to me. I think this level of overt self-deception is maybe unprecedented in a King character, except for maybe in Roland Deschain. Burn.
Got him.
I mean, there are definitely crummier people than Jack in King's works, but like the lying to himself, I've never seen it done this egregiously.
Yeah,
it's great.
Yeah, it's pretty bold. It's pretty obvious, right? Like us reading can just be like, come on, man. How do you not see that? How do you not realize that? And I think the thing with Jack is perhaps on some level he does know all this, and he refuses to accept that, actually.
Well, I think that's the great thing is this is how you write. I don't know if it's exactly the same thing as doublethink, but it's what I think of as doublethink, where he knows that he's fundamentally jealous of George, envious of George. And that's driving all of this. But he doesn't want to know that he knows that. So that's why he's spending all this energy thinking about it. You don't spend a bunch of energy thinking about something that you've got all sorted out and buttoned up and it doesn't mean anything to you. He's putting all this energy into thinking about it so he can narrativize it into the version of the story he wants to believe, which is, the poor kid with the stutter and then, I lost my temper, which is just like with this Wasp situation, something totally out of my control. Is really the kid's fault if you think about it. And basically I'm blameless and I'm awesome, actually, not just blameless. I'm amazing.
Yeah.
And that's the story. That's the story of what happened at the boarding school is that I was awesome. That's the whole story.
Yeah, it's so great because one of the things that George says to him in this moment, and he's stuttering in this, I'm not going to read the stutter, but he says, you said it ahead. You hate me because you know, and then he never gets to finish the thought, right? And so he leaves Jack with this, what do I know? I don't know anything. And that's Jack's like insistent beat throughout the rest of this chapter. I don't know anything. I don't know what you're talking about. It's so obvious, right? That's the thing is it's so like we can go ahead and say like he knows that George is, incredibly successful and is probably going to go super far in his life. He knows that George is maybe better than him. He knows that he is a failure. He knows that he's the headmaster in this dynamic. I love this again. Broken record here, but the book is never saying any of this outright because it can't, because Jack can't. But it has to gesture at it around the edges in the subtext for us to glean that. And I think it's so successful in doing that because, and I think part of that is this wonderful metaphor that Jack has created with the wasp nest that we'll get into in a bit. But it's so effective in getting this point across that like the book doesn't need to tell us what George was going to say there, because think about that. Like think about how different this scene would be if George was able to finish a sentence and tell Jack exactly what he knows, right? That would be more difficult for Jack because he would be able to feign ignorance to that. And so by building the scene in a way that has George Hatfield be unable to finish that sentence, King has created this beautiful image of a guy who is going to take any morsel of deniability and run with it. And I think it's just brilliant.
Yeah, but at the same time, the ambiguity of it, of not knowing, is sort of torturing him. So it's a double-edged thing there. I love that about it. And I have to say, you know, I'll be the broken record too. Once again, his problem is pride. He says pride is all I've got. He insists pride is all he's got, but pride is what's destroying him here. It's what's driving him to make these horrible choices. He's too proud to just kind of gracefully age into the role of a respectable school teacher, the exact job that Stephen King held as a youth, to mentor the young, promising kids and help them along with their lives, and just be a father and a husband and you know, quote unquote, nothing more. It pricks his pride far too much to be that, to have that role, and so he sabotages it. And I mean, I think that is what's operating in his psyche here.
I love this, and this goes back to what I talked about a couple weeks ago with the idea of Jack Torrance being Stephen King's worst nightmare of himself. This idea that, you know, what if, you know, he's sitting there writing his third novel and saying, like, I've made it now. I have 2 hit novels. I'm working on my third. I did it. But like, what if I never did? What if I just sold those short stories that I was selling and I never sold a novel? Like, what would I look like in 5 years and 10 years? Like, what would I be? What would that do to me? It's terrifying to think that I could be this version, this miserable old man who's looking at these young kids that have all this talent and opportunity and just get angry and resentful and hate and just filled with hatred. You know, like it's very easy to see him craft this terrifying nightmare version of himself.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree that there is a lot of autobiographical stuff happening here. I mean, definitely not 100%, of course, but I think that's why I'm loving the book so much, is the honest, the painful honesty of some of these things. I mean, I remember him saying something along the lines of like feeling these feelings of genuine anger, like real honest anger toward his small children when they were little, and finding that disturbing, but also not being able to disavow it, because he's like, I did feel that, like I can't pretend I didn't, and wanting to explore that, and that being a big source of his impetus for this novel. Wanting to understand that.
It makes you think, you know, did King ever have his own George Hatfield? You know, like what was there a moment in his life where he's leaving his teaching job and going to his second job that he has to take in order to be able to, at the laundromat, in order to be able to have enough money to pay for food for his kids. And he sees, you know, the successful jock who's also like super good at debate, is also like a super good writer, you know, just like has all these things, and just like this well of resentment builds up inside of you. I think that's very human and relatable to have that. And again, he's built the character of Jack of being like, that's a feeling that a lot of people have, but I'm going to take that further, and I'm going to allow him to act upon that anger and that hatred. And that's where we get the actual confrontation with George. Yeah.
So I just, pinging off of that, I want to take a moment to point out or suggest, I suppose, that the reason that Jack feels this way and does all of this is because George is similar to him, or similar to who he was, similar to how he saw himself as. This is a younger version of him, in other words, a good-looking jock with a bright future ahead of him. That's how Jack saw himself, and that's what that's what makes him crazy. I mean, also I think it's kind of a 2-beat so far that like George stuttered and it kind of made him, it kind of worked into this picture here, and then later Danny stutters briefly and it drives him up a wall, and I'm like, well, are we going to get a 3rd beat that reveals that like Jack also had this problem, or am I overcomplicating it? I'm just going to say that, and then I'll be right or wrong. We'll see.
Yeah, no, we'll see. Yeah, I mean, I like that. I think it is not an accident that Jack kind of casually and slyly works into this chapter that yes, he played football too. It's not
Mhm.
it's not as a comparison to George here, because he can't compare himself to George. He won't compare himself to George. But King has crafted this thing where he's talking about, when he was young, he had a lot of anger, and football really was an outlet for that anger, and that's why he did really, really well on the football field. And so now we've drawn a line of comparison between these two characters without ever explicitly doing it, because we can't explicitly do it. Another beat of wonderful structural devices here. It's just so much here, Matt. So much is so good.
Yeah. And I just have to say, I didn't do debate in the 70s. It was probably different than it was when I did debate in the early 2000s. But like, if a kid was stuttering, like they would work on that. They wouldn't be like cut from the team because they had a difficulty in speech. It's like, well, they're probably doing debate so they can practice speech in front of a group. Like that's what high school is for. It's for like training. So like the idea that you're going to cut a kid from the debate team because he stutters. It's like, no, that's why he should do debate. That's why he should be on the debate team. Are you so competitive that you can't stand the thought that maybe it'll cost your school a couple rounds? I mean, maybe that's the argument, I guess. I just see it as Jack being an asshole. But.
Yeah, it is. It's Jack totally being an asshole. It's Jack hating this kid and actually taking pleasure in his stutter in some way. Like, I think that's definitely part of it. Like, he takes pleasure in the fact that I think he says it explicitly, like, here's finally a thing that the kid struggled with. Yes, finally. And
yeah, right.
He wants to show him he failed at it. Mm-hmm. And the only way he can do that is by getting him off the team.
Yeah.
So then we come to the confrontation itself, Matt, which, okay, so a couple things here. The first is the big first thing we hear Jack say in this moment to George is, come and take your medicine. And this is the first time we've heard Jack utter these lines, which again, I think the book has been rather clear so far that the strangely familiar roke-wielding lunatic in Danny's visions is 100% his dad. Mm-hmm. But like, if you somehow missed it here, we're going to make it explicit. The line that Danny heard being said by this man has just been said by Jack. So boom, we know that now. I think again, it's not so much important whether we, the reader, know that this person is Jack. I think he's made it obvious and continues to make it very obvious. The important thing from a character and storytelling perspective is not whether we've realized it, but rather that Danny is still kind of refusing to allow himself to realize it, even though I think subconsciously he definitely knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the book is also gestured at the idea that Jack's father was abusive, and possibly hinting that the whole take your medicine thing is from him, is passed on from his father, which is pretty thin at this point, I'll admit, but I do think that there's an element of like passing on the pain of the passing on your wounds to your children, basically, as a sub theme that I'm seeing in the background. So that's why I'm mentioning it here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we don't know anything definitively, but I think it's one of those sayings that I don't just think like appears out of the ether. You know, it's not like Jack's going to wake up and start using it randomly.
Right.
So I think that's a fair guess.
Yeah. The poetry of the moment spoke to him, and he said, yeah, right.
I think the other realization this section contains, though, is the idea that Jack didn't just like punch a kid or like push a kid down. No, he beat the shit out of him, like to the point where a woman rushes up and says, "Stop! You're going to kill him." We know he has a scalp laceration. We know he's got a concussion. He's got blood coming out of his ears. He really lets George Hatfield have it, and at this point, he should just be fucking gracious that he's not in jail.
I guess the 70s were a different time. Because it's funny, because like you can imagine that given what George did, slashing somebody's tire, pretty egregious, beyond the pale. People might have overlooked it if Jack had kind of, roughed him up a little bit, maybe in the course of dragging him inside. Sure. But no, Jack managed to just grossly overdo it and look like a violent psychopath. Yeah. I mean, it's funny now that we have this full version of the story. I'm like, could he have really ever gotten that job back?
It is rather interesting that like that Al was so kind of just, oh yeah, no, you're definitely getting like they weren't even really convinced they'll like you if you sell the play. You're definitely getting your job back. And it's like, yeah, when you look at it, I mean, certainly in 2023. no, you would never teach in a school again for the
Yeah.
rest of your life, like
Right.
definitively. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
Perhaps not. I mean, it is kind of like it, everyone, but perhaps Wendy is like being super casual about like the level of actual damage he did to this kid. Like I'm sure the kid's fine. It's not going to be any lasting injuries, but you don't just get to beat up a child. I mean, he's 17. He's 17 years old.
yeah. I mean, we can just kind of say this was the old days. You know, that maybe there wasn't photographic evidence. Maybe, you know, for all we know, outside of the people who directly saw the event in its immediate aftermath, it's just rumors and you can't really prove it, etc.
I guess.
I don't know.
Go home and look at the kid's face.
Yeah, right. I mean,
He's
I
got
don't
a
know.
dent in his car too that has blood in the middle of it, right? So he shoved the kid's head into his car. Like,
yeah, no, I actually really like how the beating is left to our imagination. It's basically like he saw red,
mm-hmm.
and then we see a short list of a few injuries, but it's like, was he just like ground and pounding the kid on the asphalt?
Yeah, I don't know.
Like we don't know. That's the thing, is like we just get to imagine like some savage beating that we never saw, which is, in my opinion, worse than if we had seen it.
Yeah, and it's so great because actually the seeing red and like the losing track of time is actually a thing that Jack uses to further his argument here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like it was out of his control. Like the idea that like, you know, I think for most people, the idea that you lost so much control that you just saw red and don't remember what happened would be terrifying. That'd be terrifying to lose that much control of yourself. But to Jack, it's perfect. It fits with his narrative. It's like, this happened to me. I didn't do it. Like I lost my, as you said, not I lost my temper, but my temper was lost. And therefore, like, and I don't remember doing it. So it couldn't be me. It wasn't me that did it. You know, it's just like, and once again, to go back to the metaphor he created at the beginning of the story, which is this idea that like, I felt creatively trapped in the school, and so I invented a reason to get fired by beating up a child.
Oh my god, yeah, that's why he has to put so much energy into the narrativizing. That's why we get a whole chapter of him sitting on the roof telling himself the story.
Yeah. So Jack decides here that when the world stings you, the only option you have is to sting back. And thus, he uses his defeat of the wasp nest with a bug bomb as a metaphor for his own self-improvement. He defeated the wasp, he defeated the nest of his life, and he says, "I'm getting better." The sound of his own voice, confident in the silent afternoon, reassured him, even though he hadn't meant to speak it out loud. He was getting better. It was possible to graduate from passive to active, to take the thing that had once driven you nearly to madness as a neutral prize of no more than occasional academic interest. And if there was a place where this thing could be done, this was surely it. And then at the end of that hopeful sentence, it's, he went down the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay. They would pay for stinging him.
Always remember that saying out loud to yourself, "I'm getting better," while ruminating and thinking they'll pay, and thinking with satisfaction back upon moments when you beat up a child. Those are all signs that you're getting better.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good thing to say as we close the chapter. You know, George Hatfield got kicked out of school, right? And I'm not saying that it's okay to slash a person's tires. That's not okay to do. He shouldn't have done that. But it is true. I think the book has made it clear that it's true that Jack was kind of fucking with him on a level that was like psychological torture on some on some levels. Like,
yeah, you could argue that Jack was pushing him to a breaking point. I mean, maybe even you could go so far as to say Jack recognized the similarities down to the level of like, oh, this is a kid who's like me, in the sense that if I push him, he will push back. And that's what I want to happen. I want to push this to a conflagration.
I want him to lose his temper. And that's exactly what George Hatfield did. And it's great. Yeah.
Especially, you know, if you allow for the idea that, that Jack has a little bit of The Shining, and he would really understand on a deeper level that this kid might have that weakness.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. All right, so we move on to chapter 15, Down in the Front Yard. And as the chapter says, we have moved from the roof down to the front yard as Danny and Wendy return from their trip to Sidewinder. I kind of love the opening of this chapter because it shows us that as Jack is quote unquote doing better, Wendy is doing better. I love, we see like the two joking around with each other here. Like, I love the writing here. That's all I am to you, Jack cried, clapping his hand to his forehead. Just a dray horse, a common beast of the field. Dray here, dray that, dray everywhere. Just dray that milk right into the kitchen, mister. It's too much, he cried and threw himself on the ground while Danny stood over him and giggled. Get up, you ox, Wendy said, and prodded him with the toe of her sneaker. See, he said to Danny, she called me an ox. You're a witness. Witness, witness, Danny concurred gleefully and broad jumped his prone father. Like, this is just King writing happiness, right? He's just writing this family that perhaps for the first time is breathing this sigh of relief. And there are ominous tones under it, but from Wendy's perspective, you know, things are good. She says here in this opening bit that she's the happiest she's been since their marriage, and I believe she actually means that too. I really do.
Yeah, and we can see here Danny's giggling and acting like a 5-year-old. You know, like giggling, jumping on his dad, delightful. Like, this is the way I think of 5-year-olds as behaving, not these mournful, you know, monologues that Danny gives. So we're seeing him basically also being really happy. What, you know, though he is kind of losing weight and stuff. In this moment, he's happy.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big reveal, though, that you know, as Wendy is doing well, Jack is outwardly doing well, but we know what's going on inside. Little Danny does not seem to be adjusting quite as well as the other two, because that's we learn he's losing weight, he's not really eating anymore, and we get this beat that he's pushing really hard to learn how to read, almost kind of scarily hard. And of course, we're going to spend the next few chapters talking about Danny. He's like the main focus of the rest of this week's reading. But I wanted to present this idea that he's pushing himself really hard to read right here when it was first introduced, and we'll kind of get the reveal of why that is a little bit later.
Yeah, no, I definitely did not figure out immediately that the reason why he was pushing himself to read was to understand the messages that Tony was sending him. But yeah, anyway.
But the book makes that pretty clear quickly.
Yeah.
So Jack gives Danny the now dead wasp nest, assuring him and Wendy that all the wasps are dead now, and it's going to be 100% safe. And then it's all fine. It's all good here now.
How are you? Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know. I think even if I had not known what would happen here, it would be pretty clear what was going to happen here.
Yeah. And then the chapter ends with Wendy discussing the wasps, and she says, and I want to talk to you about this for a bit because I really love this writing. She says, I hate them. What? Wasps? Anything that stings, she said. Her hands went to her elbows and cupped them, her arms crossed over her breasts. Okay, so first of all, that line takes a lot of meaning, right? Stings. Yeah. The specific anything that stings.
Right. Yeah, because Jack basically just wholeheartedly identified himself in his own mind as like a thing that stings. He stung George because George metaphorically stuck his hand between the metaphorical roof tiles that was Jack's self-image. And thus Jack stung him, and then Jack very much stung the wasps. Yeah. And so yeah, I love this idea. Things that sting. And I
love this last sentence as well here, because I mean, this is, you could say this is just another excuse for Stephen King to talk about boobies, but I don't think that is. So like, her hands went to her elbows and cupped them, her arms crossed over her breasts. This is a very defensive posture she's taking, right? Like, she's covering her chest up, she's hiding her hands under her armpits, and she's covering her chest, she's covering her breast. That is a very defensive posture she's taking right there. And it's not because she's afraid of the wasps, Matt. I think covering her breasts, covering a part of her that I'm sure Jack loves to grab a few times, I think is to me very, very telling. That I think there's more. Wendy is aware of much more going on here too. Maybe not consciously, certainly not consciously, but I think she is.
Yeah, I think I agree with that much. That yes, she is projecting some defensiveness. Yes, she is projecting it toward Jack, but I don't think she knows that she's scared of Jack. But I think on some level she is.
Yeah. All right, so now we move on to chapter 16, titled Danny. We pick up with the Torrences later that night as Danny works on his reading while Jack in the other room works on his play. Again, we see that Danny is pushing really hard out of here, not wanting to stop. And as we said, the book doesn't come out and say it until later, but it's clear he's doing this because he keeps getting these warning signs from Tony that he cannot read, and he wants to be able to read them very much.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And then we get this part, and I just wanted to talk to you about this for a bit because this is just a little bit of interesting character work for Wendy here. He was private about his bathroom functions. While both she and Jack were pretty much catch as catch can, another sign that they were multiplying all the time, that there was another human being in the place, not just a carbon copy of one of them or a combination of both. It made her a little sad. Someday her child would be a stranger to her, and she would be strange to him. But not as strange as her own mother had become to her. Please don't let it be that way. God, let him grow up and still love his mother. So I think this is really great because, we have all this stuff going on with Jack, all this internal stuff, and we still are making time for a lot of internal conflict going on with Wendy, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the Wendy stuff is pretty great. We spent a bit less time, and I have a bit less clarity on what exactly we're doing, but the Wendy stuff is absolutely amazing to me. I think what I was thinking about this bit here is like, so okay, so Wendy has this fear that Danny's going to grow up to reject her, and I'm thinking like, well, if your kid grows up to reject you, that's usually because the parent couldn't put the kid first, right? In some big important way, the parent sort of can't compromise, can't love fully. I don't know how to put it exactly, but basically it's like that's under your control, Wendy. Like the only person who really controls whether Danny loves you when he's older is you. And I love that because it is sort of a counterpoint or riff on Jack's conflict where it's once again it's like a feeling of not being in control of your future or your life when in reality it's like, well, you're the only person who's in control of this. You're the only person who can do anything about it. And yeah, like I mean, I think what is sort of being put into play here is this idea that out of fear that Danny is going to withdraw from her, she causes him to withdraw from her. Which again is the sort of thing where it's like, well, if you had just loved fully and without reservation, then this wouldn't have happened. I'm not saying that that's the direction the story's going to go in. I think that is the conflict that is being set up, though, and I think that Wendy, sort of passes that test, and while Jack kind of fails his own sort of parallel test.
Yeah, I love everything you said there. I think we can kind of put it in Jack's terms of passive and active, right? That Wendy in here is kind of framing the idea that Danny might one day not love her anymore as a passive thing that she has no control over. Which and of course that's not true. I think it is really interesting to compare the two of them though, and what they faced in their childhoods and the ways. As you kind of gesture towards that they're dealing with it now in their adulthood, because in a way you could say both of them were abused by a parent. I think Jack was physically abused by his father, and I think you could say Wendy's mother did some mental abuse on her. We don't know the full scope of that, but it seems like their relationship is so contentious and so emotionally tinged for Wendy that her mother was really cruel to her, and and yet they have kind of reacted to that in very different ways. And it is really interesting that like Jack frames this as like everything, look at all this bad stuff that happened to me and only me and no one else understands it. And he knows that Wendy has this incredibly troubled past. And I mean, I think one of the things we learned is that one of the things that made Wendy fall in love with him was his ability to push her to kind of confront the relationship with her mother and break it off when it got too unhealthy. And so it's really interesting that like he knows about her past, he knows what she's been through as well, and yet he kind of seems like this is woe is me, this is just the things that happened to me, Jack, because I just happened to stick my hand in a wasp nest. Meanwhile, there's a woman who went through something not the same but similar, that is trying to adjust to it herself as much as she can, and doing so kind of silently while trying to deal with your shit.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think what Jack might say is like, "Oh yeah, sure. I mean, it's painful for your mom to treat you that way, but that's nothing like what I had to put up with my old man, or something like
Sure.
that. You know, something
Sure.
something where it simultaneously like acknowledges the similarity while dismissing the real magnitude of it."
Hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, no, I mean, I do think it's very similar, right? I think the kind of psychological abuse that Wendy's mom perpetrated on her was very much the same kind of abuse that a physically violent man does, where it's all about getting a sense of satisfaction and superiority. It's just instead of hitting, her mom did it with words and belittling comments.
Gosh, I love these characters so much, man.
Yeah, me too.
So Wendy goes to check on Danny and finds the bathroom door locked and her son unresponsive. As panic sets in, they eventually break the door down and find Danny in a trance, clearly being led by Tony once again. And this is the moment that you were talking about, Matt, where he's Danny is like brought out of his trance and says, "What's and then Jack just screams at him, "Don't stutter." And I think we could perhaps make the argument, or maybe perhaps the book is telling us to make the argument, that this could just be connected to his unresolved issue with George Hatfield, right? That he's harboring a lot of guilt for that stuff, and so he reacts in a similar way. But maybe you were onto something about some stuttering when he was younger.
Yeah, right. I mean, it could very well be this sort of deep trigger where this was something that his dad screamed at him about, and he had a lot of self consciousness about it, and so forth. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. That could be totally wrong. It's funny, whenever stuttering comes up, my latent stutter comes back. But let's not mention that, because then it'll come back even worse. You know, my other comment about this scene about them freaking out because Danny is having his episode is like, yeah, but when your second kid has their shining fugue in the bathroom, you just tell them to splash some water in their face and get back to bed. You don't make a big deal out of it.
That's great. I don't know that yet, man. I only have one kid. Everything's a crisis moment.
No, you'll see, Scott.
I really love this moment, though, where this whole thing, this whole event, this whole episode reminds Wendy too much of the broken arm incident. Like, Jack screams at his son and then is immediately apologetic. And it like triggers her in a way. And she rushes in, she grabs her son away from Jack. And we see this is something that he absolutely clocks, that he sees this, he sees her do this, and he's immediately angry. And like, you can't blame her though, right? Like this is just the way it's going to be now. Sorry, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I think the painful part here is just Jack kind of realizing that he's never really going to live that down. And furthermore, he's really not okay with that fact. I think this is the way in which you can classify Jack as a narcissist, is that it's not just that he needs to be the hero in the story in his own mind. He actually needs to be the hero in the story in Wendy and Danny's mind too. Which is pretty toxic and destructive to everyone around you.
Sure.
As a personality trait.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with that. So Danny is muttering about Roke. He's saying that Tony was teaching him the rules. And then he also just offhandedly mentions something about a timer, which we also see freaks the fuck out of Jack Torrance, which I love, Matt. I absolutely love.
Yeah, it's always funny how Jack continually manages to tell himself, like, no, he didn't say timer, he said something else. It's just a constant trait of Jack that he's able to confabulate things that make him feel better.
No, he definitely didn't say the word timer. Yeah. Definitely not. And then we get the first instance of this, and I'm just bring it up here because we can talk about it later as it occurs more. But this is the first instance of Jack wiping his mouth. We see he took his handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his mouth with it. Wendy had a moment of that sickening time is running backwards feeling again. It was a gesture she remembered well from his drinking days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to comment a minute ago about how, Wendy was the happiest she's ever been, but like, it's easy to be happy when everything's going great, and external circumstances being what they are, they can really hide all manner of problems. But here we see really a relatively minor thing goes amiss, and like the wheels completely come off. Like everybody was happy. like an hour ago.
Yeah.
And now it's like everybody's angry, screaming, defensive. Jack's wiping his mouth with the alcoholism wipe. And it's like, oh my God, like slightest perturbation causes everything to go off the, and that just tells you like, oh no, oh dear, the situation we're about to go into, it's not as good as it appears to be right now, because right now everything is just perfect, actually, externally.
The only actual healthy relationship these three have together is when everything is picturesque and perfect. And, as we said at the beginning of the reading, golden day after golden day, right? The first instant that you put any kind of stressor or pressure on this thing, it all just crumbles. Absolutely. And and you're right. That's what we're setting up. We're setting it up with a small one, knowing that there's going to be bigger ones coming forward in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone calms down and they go to put Danny to bed. Danny, of course, asks for his father to stay behind because he's closer with his dad and wants to talk to him. He tells him he can't remember what Tony showed him, except something about how Roke has innings like baseball. And for the first time, he asks his dad about red rum, which his dad hears as red drum and doesn't know what to do with. And then we get that wonderful scene that I think both movies have taken verbatim, where Danny asks his father, "You wouldn't hurt mommy or me, would you?"
Oh God, that's one of my favorite moments of the book. Really, just the way that's written, the authenticity of the moment of like this child who's drifting off, but also sharing. Like, it's like the closer Danny gets to sleep, the lower his defenses get, because you feel like a fully awake, cogent Danny wouldn't ask that question, because he would kind of know, he would know better.
Sure.
But no, I just love this scene so much.
Yeah. It's great. And I'm not the perfect parent, never will be the perfect parent, but I gotta say, if I can make it through my child rearing days without my kid ever having to ask me point blank if I would ever hurt his mother or him, I will call that a success.
Yeah. Just try to avoid staring at him like Jack Nicholson stares at. Yeah, well, you'll be fine.
So with Danny asleep, Jack and Wendy discuss the incident, glad they had already made a doctor's appointment for the next morning because they were worried about Danny. Jack, for the first time, suggests that if Danny is seriously unwell in some way, that he and Wendy should leave Jack behind and go to Wendy's mother's place and leave him to take care of the hotel himself. Something that Wendy, unsurprisingly, is completely unwilling to do. And I think this is the first one where you see, like, from a structural storytelling standpoint, why the estranged relationship with Wendy and her mother matters to the plot. Obviously it matters to the character, but why it matters to the plot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really like, from a storytelling perspective, how the plot element of Wendy having no alternative to staying at the Overlook with Jack, despite these signs that it's a bad idea, is then tied directly with her own character struggle. I think that's really tight writing.
Yeah, definitely. It shows what she's going through, and like perhaps they could leave earlier, but that's a no-go for her. So it's just everyone's kind of trapped.
Exactly.
So from here we go back to Danny, who is having another nightmare / premonition. He's in the hotel being chased by Jack with the Roke mallet. This is our first instance of the book telling us that Danny will, quote, remember what was forgotten. But we see here that Danny can't really remember it right now. I'm being a little coy because obviously I know, but can you guess what is being referred to here?
I'm going to take a stab at it because it's always fun to watch me flounder.
Sure.
I mean, the one thing is I remember, would be remembering when his dad broke his arm, like that being a memory that he's repressed. But, well, number one, I just don't think that's going to be it. But number two, I think it's probably meant more metaphysically, like forgotten in some more general sense, like remembering the hotel's dark past, or remembering the things that the ghosts represent, or something. I mean, what's funny about, books is like it could mean some very specific thing and simultaneously mean the idea of remembering the forgotten dark past in a broader sense.
Sure. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
So Danny finds himself cornered in the hotel, and right before he sees the person chasing him come around a corner, he wakes up with 3 wasps on his arm, which sting him immediately. Oops.
Oh. Oh
Oops,
no.
my
Oops.
bad.
Yeah. It's oh god. This is yeah. I mean it's easy to kind of for us to get all like silly and sarcastic when we're talking about this stuff, but like it's the thought that you have given your kid something that has hurt them
Yeah,
is another one of those things where you're like, oh god, like it makes it like hurts me in my stomach
yeah,
just to like read this, you know.
definitely. I mean, the line "Daddy, you said you killed them all" is one of the most heartbreaking lines in all of this, right?
Yeah.
And it's not even a line of like anger or resentment to your father. Like I think Wendy feels anger and resentment towards Jack for this because Wendy blames Jack for this, but for Danny, it's more just a statement of fact of of almost like absolute confusion of I don't understand. Everything about my world I know is that when my daddy says something, that's what is, right? The
Mhm.
idea, remember when the car is struggling to get up the steep grade to get to the Overlook, Danny's like, Daddy says it's going to make it, so it's going to make it. That's just the way it is. And Daddy said the Wasps were dead, and the Wasps aren't dead. And it's like, again, this horrible realization that that I think everyone realizes has to realize eventually that your parents don't know everything and aren't gods. And for a 5-year-old, though, that's quite a lot.
Well, it's one thing for your parents to have like a minor oversight, but it's another for their parent to have kind of this now established track record of basically being
Yeah,
directly responsible for hurting you.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah.
So Jack rushes into the kitchen to get something to cover the wasp nest, leaving Wendy and Danny to fight off the wasps. Like he just leaves them alone in the room as there's a bunch of wasps stinging them. This is the best metaphor that's been constructed in this whole thing because Jack puts his hand in the wasp nest, but it's Danny and Wendy that have to deal with the consequences of
Oh, I love that so much. That's great.
it. So Jack, in another great move of pushing the blame on someone else, decides that what happened here is that the bug bomb must have been defective, that it's not his fault for giving his son a wasp nest, it's the bug bomb's fault. And he starts snapping pictures of Danny's stings so they can sue the shit out of the makers of the bomb. Does Matt, does this hurt the metaphor if Jack wasn't wrong per se? He just didn't really count on a magical hotel magically resurrecting some dead wasps.
Um, I don't know, man. It's entirely possible that in the future the text tells us directly that there's a magical evil hotel in play. But I like I said earlier, like it is funny to me the idea that Jack just misunderstood the instructions and it's all his fault.
Very possible. Very possible.
I don't know if it messes up the metaphor. I'm trying to think about that because like giving your kid a wasp nest is one of those things where I probably wouldn't do that. This is I mean, we can have a little interesting parenting sidebar here because
Sure.
like I actually have noticed in my own behavior that I will actually model what I see as like healthy risk taking around my kids, especially if they seem to be afraid of something.
Mm-hmm.
I will be like, nope, we're going to do that now. And of course, I'm using my own adult judgment to be like, this is actually safe and
Sure.
fine, and that's why we're going to do it. And in the same way, if you have a wasp nest that you've thoroughly fumigated, you can. I do feel like Jack, has a kind of healthy adult level of confidence in like, yeah, I killed all the wasps. The wasps are dead, and I'm going to give it to Jack. I'm going to give it to Danny. It's going to be fine. And then the fact that it's not. I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting because definitely you don't want to just protect your children from every possible risk because
Yeah.
that's not how you live a life. I don't have an answer to you here. Actually, this is an interesting question though.
I don't know. Like I probably wouldn't want my kid with a giant wasp nest on his bedside table. Like I think I would definitely go like, hey, look at this cool thing, because I think actually wasp nests are actually really cool.
Yeah.
Like to break it open and see the inside and see how it's constructed is really cool. But just as like a thing to put on your shelf, be like, hey, I got this thing on my shelf. I don't know. I think of course we have to say that the reason why Jack does this is because his dad did the same for him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that ties into your theories before about kind of this generational passing on of trauma thing that, well, my dad did it for me, and so I'm going to do it for you. And oh, actually, this was a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're past. I mean, I think that's actually a great, like, one fun way in which the metaphor works is like you're passing down something that you think is benign, but it is not actually.
Yeah. And I mean, we haven't talked about this directly yet, but speaking of passing on things to Danny, I do think we see in Danny a little bit here with the Tony visions and his kind of inability to both remember them and also to kind of admit to himself that he knows exactly who the man chasing him is. Maybe that's a little bit of Jack getting passed down to him, right? His ability to craft narrative to avoid coming to the realization of the true nature of something. Perhaps
100%.
that's some Jackisms there.
I think, well, it could, yes, I think it is Jackisms, but also I think there's just a general theme of that throughout all three of our characters, because
Sure.
Wendy is also in a differently flavored sort of denial, but denial nonetheless, about like the state of her marriage and the kind of man that Jack is, and how great it's all going to be at the Overlook and all these things. Like they're all sort of mutually participating in this denial and self-deception festival in different ways. But no, I mean, I do like the idea that this is a trait of Jack's that Danny has absorbed specifically.
Yeah, and man, I really so the thing I love most about this is that the problem is not just that these wasps came back and they hurt his son. The problem is that Jack created a metaphor of this wasp nest, right? He made the wasp nest representative of all the bad times in his life, of everything wrong he did, of everything that happened to him, and his killing of it was his defeating of it. And now it's come back, right? Like we get this wonderful moment of they had come back. He had killed the wasps, but they had come back. And so he, this idea that in his mind, like I love this. We've talked about King and how he uses metaphor in his stories a lot, and we've talked kind of about how King is not really like sly with his metaphor usage. Like when he drafts a metaphor, he almost always tells you about it, and he either tells you about it through the narrator just explaining what the metaphor is, or in this case, it's not actually the narrator crafting the metaphor. It's not the story crafting the metaphor. It's the characters doing it. And I think, by the way, this is why he likes writing about writers so much, because writers think in metaphor. And so his characters think in metaphor all the time. And so this is a metaphor that functions in the story for us, but it also is also a metaphor for the character. And therefore, when we see the wasp nest come back to life, it doesn't just mean something to us, the reader. It means something to the character. And he has this kind of horrifying realization.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that's an interesting question. Like, I'm wondering. I'm trying to think of like, when have I ever like constructed an elaborate metaphor in my mind, and then that metaphor paid off in some cosmically literary sense? Probably not never, but probably not very often either. But not. It works great on the page.
Definitely.
I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure about this, but I'll just throw it out, and maybe you'll have something interesting. But I keep thinking about the phrase "lose your temper." It's an interesting. The word "temper" is just an interesting word to me, because it's this word that we like to dig into language when we're able to, and it's this word that kind of has this like metallurgical second meaning that's like the hardness and elasticity of the metal. Like if you're making steel, you want the steel to be tempered so that it has the right degree of the desirable properties. It's and then I can't help but extend that to the common kingism of saying that some character who's just a real badass, who you're going to be able to rely on in a pinch, they have their deep steel. And it's steel as a metaphor for this kind of inner strength and resiliency. And I just love this idea that losing your temper is a sort of contrast to the idea of having deep steel, being the kind of person who loses their temper. It's like, well, Jack's missing that steel, or that steel fails whenever it's actually needed, because it loses its hardness and its springiness and its edge, and it just becomes destructive to itself.
That's so good, man. I never thought of it that way. I love the idea of losing your temper as literally losing your steel. That's That's great. I love that. I love that very much. I think I had no idea if that was intentional or not, but it certainly works.
Yeah, I mean, I like it so much that I'm just going to pretend that it's totally textual.
That's what we do, man. That's what we do.
Exactly.
I love the way this chapter ends, though. So Jack has had this realization, and he's taking the wasp nest outside, and we see he crossed the kitchen again and shut off the lights. He stood in the darkness for a moment, thinking, wanting a drink. Suddenly the hotel seemed full of 1,000 stealthy sounds, creakings and groans, and the sly sniff of the wind under the eaves, where more wasps' nests might be hanging like deadly fruit. They had come back. And suddenly he found he didn't like the Overlook so well anymore. As if it wasn't wasps that had stung his son, wasps that had miraculously lived through the bug bomb assault, but the hotel itself.
Oh, God. Yeah, no.
Fortunately, he will take this realization and move forward, not liking and trusting the hotel anymore, right?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, oh, wait, I read further than this.
There's 2 chapters from now. The exact opposite is going to happen.
That's true. Yeah.
But it's okay because the chapter ends with Jack resolving to never lose his temper again, and he never did. The end. Yep.
That's what happens every time I lose my temper. I tell myself I'll never lose it again, and then it works until the next time anyway.
Yeah. There's a Mad TV skit with, I think it's Bob Newhart in it, and the skit is a woman going to a psychiatrist, and like she lays out all her problems for him, and he goes, all right, here's what I want you to do. Stop it. She's like, what? Just stop it. And that's basically what it is. Oh, you're losing your temper? Well, just don't do that anymore. Just that's how you solve the problem. You just don't do it.
That's not what therapy is.
No.
Oh. Wow. I better look into that.
Stop it. Oh my God. I haven't watched that skit in forever.
That's great. I want to watch it.
I'll find it for you.
Okay.
All right. So we move on to chapter 17, titled The Doctor's Office. The chapter starts with Danny getting an EEG to make sure he's okay. And of course, it comes back normal. But then Danny has a talk with the doctor about our friend Tony. I love the way we show Danny like decide that this is a trustworthy doctor. He peeks into his mind, and we see, quote, suddenly he gets an oddly comforting image in his head. File cabinets, their doors sliding shut one after another, locking with a click. Written on the small tabs in the center of each door was A through C, secret, D through G, secret, and so on. I love that. It's just like he peers into this guy's head and just sees locked filing cabinets and is like, I can trust him with my secrets.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the guy seems like a really great doctor overall.
Yeah.
Although, unfortunately, I think he kind of ends up in the same bucket as Dick Halloran, where it's like well-meaning, nice guy, but kind of too little too late.
Yeah, we get all these people surrounding them that are just like, maybe I should be more worried about this. Maybe I should have acted upon this, but we're just not gonna.
Yeah, right.
So Danny tells the doctor that he doesn't know who Tony is, that he used to like him, and he looked forward to his visits. But since the move to Colorado, Tony has only shown him scary things, and he doesn't much like him anymore. The doctor asks Danny if he can make Tony come now, and he does so. First, he does this by, concentrating, which leads him into the mind of his mama and sees how he's worried sick about Danny. Again, the empathy with which this book has for Wendy, I think is remarkable. This is again a thing that I think was lost in translation to both the adaptations, that like just understanding what's going on in Wendy's mind like opens up that character to you so much more. And we see here that she's like almost frantic inside her brain, worried about him, comparing what's happening him to a traumatic event from her childhood, which is that we learn this now. Her sister was run over by a car and killed, which is another Kingism, by the way.
Uh-huh.
I feel like King has little sisters getting run over by cars a lot. Like Henry and Eddie's had a sister that got run over by a car. I think there's more instances than that. It's just a thing he turns to. What do you think that is?
I mean, I think it's a kind of relatable, horrible, like mind-shatteringly horrible thing that nonetheless could happen to anybody, could happen to any family. I think this is like core to what King understands about the nature of horror. Like evil demon hotels aren't real, but like little sisters being killed by cars is real. and he knows how to tie the two together to elevate them or to amplify the impact of the ideas that he's exploring.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So then we go see Danny, and basically what happened in this scene, Matt. I'm trying to explain this because it's kind of weird. We basically go into what is going to happen in the next chapter, right? We basically, through Tony, fast forward to chapter 18 with Jack down in the basement looking at old documents. I mean, that's the basic way of describing it, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think I grasped at the time that like it was Jack looking at the documents, but yeah, I mean, it's a warning specifically related to the documents in the basement for sure.
He sees it's his daddy. He knows and sees it's his daddy.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
And I wanted to read this part for you because it says, the weak glow disclosed a stone floor that looked damp and pleasant. Somewhere not far in the distance was a steady mechanical roaring sound, but muted, not frightening, soporific. It was the thing that would be forgotten, Danny thought with a dreamy surprise. Well, there goes that, Matt.
Oh, I get it.
It's the furnace. It's the boiler.
Yeah.
It's the boiler.
Okay.
Which again is an interesting, like, King like sets up a mystery and then kind of solves it well before it's going to matter to the plot.
I mean, I do wonder if I would get it if I didn't already know the boiler thing.
I feel like a line not far down from here, Danny sees and says, "Oh, it was the boiler." Or like okay, he doesn't say the thing that would be forgotten was the boiler, but he said, "Oh, the noise was the boiler." So like, I don't know. I think we're being pretty explicit here.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean,
I don't think we know the reason for why that I guess you could maybe make a mental leap of why that matters with the information you know at this point, but I don't know.
It's definitely, I don't know why it's surprising to me, since King loves to spoil the things that he's going to do later in the story. But it is kind of funny to me that he would feel a need to spoil the idea that the boiler is going to blow up the hotel when that's already kind of been foreshadowed once.
Pretty heavily, yeah.
So I don't know. I guess he just likes to make sure that he's sort of playing fairly and letting you know what's at stake.
Mm-hmm. So Danny sees his daddy reaching towards some old books, specifically a white leather book, which we know in a one chapter's time is the scrapbook that Jack spends all his time in that chapter leafing through. He suddenly and just weirdly feels the need to reach out to his daddy, telling him not to open it, telling him this is dangerous. But of course, he can't do that because he's just envisioning this, and he has no power to actually change anything. What did you think of this idea generally of the thing that Danny's seeing is his dad just looking at a scrapbook?
Yeah, it's less clear to me right now why like Jack's interest in the history of the hotel would be the thing that kind of draws him in and lets the hotel get its hooks in him. I guess on the level of theme, the idea is, you know, peering into your past is obviously an important concept here, where you've got different characters like Jack who are sort of avoiding it, and peering into the past of the hotel, I guess, has some. I don't know. I feel like I don't have the full development of what we're doing with this idea quite yet. Sure,
and actually, I mean, I'm kind of spoiling the conversation we're going to have in the next chapter, but I do think that's kind of why we're doing this way, because I think what King wants is, as Jack starts leafing through all these documents in chapter 18, he wants this feeling of ominousness. He wants this feeling of concern and worry about why Jack is doing this. And without this scene, maybe that wouldn't have been there, right? Because it is just a guy looking at history documents. But now King has established in this scene that through the mystical Tony, we know that him doing this is bad, and is going to be bad for him, and is going to be bad for everyone. We don't really understand why yet, but we do have we are equipped with the right feeling in that moment.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and you're right that without that, we wouldn't necessarily have the right level of context for understanding what we're really supposed to be paying attention to in that scene.
Yeah. So Tony also starts repeating the phrase, "This inhuman place makes human monsters." And he's not talking about Twitter. He's talking about the hotel. Sorry, I had to do that. But I love that line though. This inhuman place makes human monsters. You know, that's important, right? I mean, this idea that like the threat here is perhaps not necessarily the ghosts, right? It's Jack. It's the human
Yeah.
monsters that can be created by this place.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure exactly like how much damage the hotel can do on its own, but for sure, the idea that it kind of needs the vessel of the person to do the most damage
Mm-hmm.
is great.
So everything swirls together for Danny, and he suddenly finds himself back in the doctor's office, unable to remember anything he learned from Tony, which is pretty fucking inconvenient. You know, Tony's desperately trying to impart all this information, and he's just not retaining any of it.
Yeah, I mean, Tony, you came on way too strong. It actually prompts a serious question for me, which, I mean, you don't have to answer, but like, I'm thinking, like, is Tony like real? Is Tony a being, or is Tony sort of an imaginary projection of Danny's to help him understand the nature of his shining? I don't know, and I don't know if it
Mhm.
matters, but I guess it just is a question that came up in this moment.
Sure. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not
Okay.
even going to answer. I'm not even going to give you information on if I know the answer to the question or not, because even that
Yeah.
would be giving you too much information.
Yeah.
So
Or even if you know whether you can resolve that question.
yeah, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know anything. I know nothing.
Okay. Okay.
So the doctor asks Danny to go into the waiting room and talks to both of his parents, attempting to get to the bottom of what's going on. I think it's really interesting here, Matt, that in this scene, we see Jack be like super candid with the doctor. Perhaps if we wanted to read into the subtext, perhaps he's picking on the same level of trustworthiness that Danny did, you know, maybe with his version of The Shining. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, there's something of a quality of a confession in this interaction where,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
like if Jack's thinking, like, if I lay it all out, then I may be forgiven, or I think he might want something like that out of this interaction. And it is really
Sure.
interesting how Jack says stuff to this doctor that it's almost hard to imagine the Jack of last chapter saying to anyone. It's a real vulnerability here.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. And he goes on, you know, to admit he's an alcoholic, and then I think this is the most shocking one of all, Matt. Wendy is defending him and what he did to Danny here, and Jack says, "No, Wendy, I meant to do it. I guess someplace inside, I really did mean to do that to him, or something even worse. And if I didn't know any better, Matt, I would assume that it was Jack taking some fucking responsibility for the things he did." It's not. It's not.
It's not. But like, why does he volunteer this? It's a strange and fascinating choice.
I actually have a theory about this.
Okay.
I think the reason he does this now is because he's kind of convinced himself that he's beaten it and it's getting better.
Mm.
So it's not him anymore. And he's able to distance himself from that person so much that he's able to admit what that person did. You know, like in the moment you can't do it, and when you're still in the middle of the shit, when you still have your hand in that wasp nest, admitting that you're responsible for it is just beyond the pale. But in this idea that I am not that person anymore, I am a better person now, I am getting better, I am on the road to recovery, and everything's going to be fine from here on out, it's much easier to admit the bad things that you did.
I love that. Yeah, old Jack did that, but old Jack's a monster and an asshole.
Yeah.
I would never do that.
Yeah.
Again, because I said I won't lose my temper anymore. No,
I said it.
That's great. I love
I
that.
said it out loud. And as we know, saying things out loud means they absolutely are true.
Mm-hmm. That's why I talk to myself constantly.
That's why we have a podcast.
Right.
So then the doctor proceeds to tell them his incredibly rational reason for why Danny is having all these things, why all these things are happening to Danny. And I find this so fascinating, Matt, because we basically spend the 20 pages of this chapter here with a doctor offering up all the realistic, logical, rational interpretations of The Shining. Not some magical ESP power, but just like super perceptiveness, super empathy. And we already know textually that that's not true, right? We know textually that Danny has a power. We know that this is the case. So why do it? Why have us go through all this rigmarole of having this guy say all this stuff, offer all these completely logical, rational examples, and then kind of just have Wendy go, "Yeah, but you haven't lived with him. I like there's definitely something going on here. Why do that?"
I mean, I don't know if I have a perfect answer, but the closest thing I have, unfortunately, requires that I reference the not so great TV adaptation. And the reason is that I have to say how that scene didn't work and how this version of the scene does. So in the adaptation, there's a doctor scene, but it's like bland. It's just so. There's nothing to the scene or how it's performed or how it's shot beyond just like the surface level of the dialogue. But this scene in the book, the whole substance of it is the subtext. The subtext is, this is all bullshit. The doctor's dead wrong. And we know it. We, the reader, know it. And King, you're right that he's not stepping away and being an omniscient narrator, but like in the text knows that we know it, and we're kind of in on the joke together. So we're sitting back from this scene being like, "Oh, you idiots. Like, come on, just like you're so off base, and you're sleepwalking into disaster." And thus there's this current of dread and dramatic irony that's very intentionally built into the scene, and how it's structured and how it culminates even in, it ends with the doctor specifically says to Wendy, were you thinking about your dead sister out there in the waiting room? And Wendy's like, oh my God, yes, I was. And I never think about my dead sister. And the doctor's like, oh, okay then, well, see you later. And it's just like that's the level on which the scene is effective.
Yeah.
And the best way to underline that is to go watch the extremely inert, lifeless television scene.
No, I think you're completely spot on with this. I think that is the absolute function of the scene. And I think it's really capped by this whole thing that the doctor's entire opinion of Danny's ability to grow out of this is contingent upon this incorrect supposition that everything's cool now between Jack and Wendy, right? They've made up, divorce is no longer on the table. We're all good now. And that's just not accurate, right? That's just not, it's not a complete vision of the story. So he's kind of he's basing his conclusions off of wrong or incomplete information. And so you have all that stacking on top of each other, where I think the comparison to Dick Halloran is so perfect, because here's another character that has the chance to be like, get out of there.
Yeah, right.
that actually, and he actually says the opposite, which he confirms Jack's understanding of, or Jack's belief that this is the perfect place for him to grow out of all this stuff, and it's not. And you're so close to realizing there's something more going on here. You're so close to seeing that there's something much more dangerous going on here, and you chose to look away. You chose to ignore it. You chose to. I'm going to say this because it ties so beautifully into everything that you've been talking about this episode. You choose to build a narrative around it that makes it make sense and makes it not scary and makes you kind of devoid of any responsibility for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what Dick Halloran did too, honestly. There's also a matching beat to compare those two characters, where the doctor literally says, quote unquote jokingly, Danny, if you don't love your parents anymore, you can just come down and stay with me. And Danny's like, no sir, I love my parents. And it's very cute, but it's definitely a repeat of Dick repeatedly joking, like, why don't you come down to Florida with me, it'll be great. And
that's so good. I didn't think about that. You're 100% right there.
Yeah, it's like on some subconscious level, these people are trying to, again, I'm going to use my life preserver metaphor. Like, they're like, come on, kid, get out of there.
I just, before we go from this chapter, I wanted to point this part out too. Like, he says that you two are no longer considering divorce. Is he as right as I think he is? Yes, Wendy said, and Jack squeezed her hand tightly, almost painfully. Not subtle, Stephen King, and it works remarkably, because again, if we were wondering, like, if you hadn't connected the dots yet and are thinking, should I be trusting everything this doctor says? Here he makes this conclusion and says, yes, I think this is true, and then we have this painfully tight squeeze
Mm-hmm.
to kind of reinforce that no, that's not entirely accurate, actually.
I can't help but like stand back from the interaction and be like, it kind of seems like what the doctor's saying is like, if your marriage breaks apart, your son will probably develop schizophrenia. But so it sounds like you aren't going to break up. Oh, okay, then he'll just grow out of it. He'll be fine.
I never thought of it that way, but that is true. That's pretty fucked up, actually.
It's a very sort of like, yeah, exactly. It's like as long as you guys can mend your rift here and be okay, then the kid will be fine. But if you can't manage that, then yeah. Well,
yeah, I think it's again like the idea that like he's going catatonic.
mm-hmm.
And like, I understand the sentiment that like, all kids have imaginary friends. And like, I think actually a lot of what, if we didn't know that The Shining was a real thing that existed, I think a lot of the things that the doctor says make a certain amount of sense. But you're so right. Looking at it from this angle, it's basically saying that like, you're basically putting pressure on Wendy, right? You're telling Wendy that there's this man that on some level she is terrified of. And if you leave him, it will destroy your son forever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's, I don't think we're overreading this. I think the doctor, that is the subtext of what the doctor says. He frames it very clearly. Kids like this could develop horrific mental illness if their home environment is not stable.
Mm-hmm.
You fill in the dots, Wendy.
Yeah, and stable in his mind means nuclear, husband, wife, like complete married, happy family. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Which I'm not a psychiatrist, but I don't actually think that's true.
I think there are many different types of families and many different types of stable environments that one could create for a child.
I hope so.
Yeah. So there's also this bit at the very end that I just mentioned because I like when you have to guess things. But this says, I think the doctor says something to the effect of like, of course you know why he's named him Tony, don't you? And they're like, yes, of course, but he hasn't figured that out yet, so we won't tell him. Which is just like, it's a choice that King has intentionally kept this hidden from us too, because we're in the point of view with all these characters and we just don't actually reveal that, which is an interesting choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that like we're gonna find out that Danny's name is Danny Anthony Torrance or something like that, and that it's Tony is directly Danny in the way that I was suggesting earlier.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we'll find out, but or maybe we won't.
Maybe
I would assume when you load a Chekhov's gun like that, you will fire it at some point.
Yeah, unless he just totally forgot, which would be really funny.
Which would be very Stephen King. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that.
I'll have to bring it up in the Dark Tower later.
All right, let's move on to our final chapter of the week, chapter 18, titled The Scrapbook. Okay, this is an interesting chapter, Matt. It is a chapter filled with a ton of expository information about the history of the Overlook, and its mystery of its non-success, which is an interesting read. This is, in King's, at least of early career, usual epistolary style, where he likes to write newspaper articles and stuff, and put them in his book. But there's actually not, like, in the exposition, in the actual news clippings that we read, there's not too much to actually analyze here. So I think we're going to move through that stuff really quickly. I think there is some stuff going on with Jack that we'll get into, but I just want to kind of establish that as we move into the chapter.
Yeah. I mean, I actually love the King expository scrapbook / radio broadcasts / epistolary sections. I just love it.
I do too. I think it adds so much. It adds more than just if a narrator was kind of explaining what Jack was reading. Rather, we get to actually read a bit of the article itself.
Yeah, I agree.
What I do love about this scene, and we've kind of already talked about this, but I'll emphasize it again here, is that King has kind of primed us to be scared of it, right? We're not sure why. We're not sure why it's a bad thing for Jack to suddenly become really interested in newspaper clippings and a weird old scrapbook. But by showing Danny having a nightmare-esque vision of his dad finding the scrapbook, we're allowed to see it in that context of dread. Otherwise, what's scary about a scrapbook? What's scary about being interested in history? I'm interested in history. It sounds like this hotel has a really cool history to it. There's nothing inherently ominous there, but King has created ominousness.
He's created ominousness in the surrounding context, and then I think there is a kind of progression of the scene where it becomes darker and creepier as we go as well.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So the bit at the reopening of the ball is part of it that caught my eye. He's reading, he's imagining what the reopening ball was like, and we get here. And later, at midnight, Derwent himself crying, "Unmask, unmask!" The masks coming off, and the Red Death held sway over all. He frowned. What left field had that come out of? That was Poe, the great American hack, and surely the Overlook, the shining, glowing Overlook on the invitation he held in his hands, was the farthest cry from E.A. Poe imaginable. So there's the Mask of the Red Death from our quote from the beginning, kind of coming into the text textually. There we go.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Now, I don't remember it ever being quite so. No, that's not true. I think there were some direct references in other books. Anyway, that's it's fun.
Yeah. And also his he calls Poe the great American hack, which I really like. And then like his understanding on an unconscious level that there's not something beautiful and glowing about this. There's something ominous about it. And he can't, like, once again, he's narrating around that.
Yeah, it's the parenthetical that you just read. I love how parentheticals are used once again, where it's like an intrusion into his thought stream that he can't keep out, despite the fact that it doesn't really go with the narrative that I'm telling about how, oh, isn't this interesting? And aren't I lucky to get to be the custodian of this hotel? And then the latent, perhaps shining, perhaps just unconscious sense of how things are not quite right is poking its head through. Love it.
Yeah. So we learn about Derwent, a millionaire kook that bought the Overlook as one of his many investments and then suddenly, without warning, sold it. We learn about the disrepair and the repurchase, the stint as a key club, basically a high-class place for gangsters to hang out. Jack suddenly in all this needs to realizes that he needs to write a book about this place. He said he's going to finish his play before the end of the year, and there probably wouldn't be another writing project after that. But now, suddenly, oh, this is it. This is my writing project.
Yeah, I love it. I think, there's a pattern that's shared between this scene and the previous one where the real thing that we're paying attention to is the subtext and the implications. So here, we're not paying attention to sort of the object level of Jack thinking about writing a book. We're thinking about the implications of like, oh, the idea of this darkness and history is pulling him in like a riptide, and he's totally ignorant to it. That's the subtext that we're actually paying attention to. And then of course there's also the slow play of the darkness and the violence in this story that just kind of becomes worse and worse as it goes.
Yeah, definitely. And then we get this part here that I wanted to read to you. I think it's really important. The hotel had been closed for the rest of the decade. There was a single story about it, a Sunday feature headlined, "Former Grand Hotel Sinking into Decay." The accompanying photos wrenched at Jack's heart. The paint on the front porch peeling, the lawn a bald and scabrous mess, windows broken by storms and stones. This would be part of the book if he actually wrote it. To the phoenix going down in the ashes to be reborn. He promised himself he would take care of this place. Very good care. It seemed that before today he had never really understood the breadth of his responsibility to the Overlook. It was almost like having a responsibility to history. And I pulled this out because, as I kind of set up earlier, this is such a wonderfully stark reversal of the way he felt about the hotel literally like a week ago, where he was, the night after the wasp nest and was realizing that it wasn't even the wasp that did this. It was the hotel itself. This ominous feeling of the hotel has some power. And now suddenly, incredibly quickly, he's just like, oh my God, this hotel is the most important place in the world. I need to protect it with everything I have.
Yeah.
So other than just like the hotel fucking with him, why do you think Jack so quickly falls in love with this place after finding the scrapbook?
It's really hard not to just answer magic, but you can. I'll try anyway. I mean, you can think about the ways in which Jack and the hotel are similar. You know, they're both. Let's personify the hotel for the sake of argument. They're both entities with a dark history. They kind of want to live it down. They kind of want to get past that dark history and move on to glory. Their destiny of being a glorious, successful writer / hotel. They want to put it behind them. They want to put that past behind them and just be great and glorious. But the very refusal to face the past dooms them to repeatedly act it out, which you can see definitely in Jack's way of dealing with his own life story and retelling his narrative. You could argue that maybe the hotel is doing something similar, although I would say at this point in the story, I can't really say that actually, because I don't really understand the hotel as a character yet. But I do want to keep this in mind as a framework.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something here. I think making the hotel a metaphor for Jack actually works really well, because we can go back to our passive and active thing again, right? That may, perhaps in Jack's mind, all these things that happened to this beautiful, glorious, wonderful hotel full of potential were completely out of the hotel's control. It's not the hotel's fault that some gangsters got murdered in here. It's not the hotel's fault that this businessman just suddenly sold it. And here's this beautiful place with so much potential, and it's never seen success. It's never been as successful as it should have been. And why hasn't it? And you can absolutely see Jack slot himself perfectly into that idea of it's a place where all these bad things happened to it, not because of it. And spoilers, wrong.
Yeah, right. And ultimately at the heart of the hotel is this law, this you could even extend the metallurgical metaphor and say that there's a lack of temper, there's a lack of structural soundness to an important critical part of its being,
sure,
which is the fatal flaw, which is in other words, I'm saying that the boiler is the hotel losing its temper.
Yes, definitely, 100%. That was, by the way, the metaphor I was trying to construct in our very first week. That I was just waiting for this moment, actually.
Excellent.
So it isn't until pretty far into the scrapbook that Jack asks the pretty important question, whose fucking scrapbook is this? And it's a good question, right? And it's a good question that goes completely unanswered.
I mean, my first guess is that it's Grady's, and my only other guess is that it's Ullman's, but I think it's probably Grady's.
Mm-hmm. I think there's like... It's so great because you talked about how it gets darker and more ominous as we go through the chapter. And also as we see that it escalates from not just clippings and news clippings, but that someone, presumably the owner of the scrapbook, has started writing in the margins. And the one thing he writes is after one of the gangster murders, he writes, they took his balls along with them. It gets so darker and ominous. And we don't know whose it is, but
very macabre.
It just the idea that it took Jack so long to think of that question of who compiled all this stuff, who compiled this history, why would they do it?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point.
So finally, Wendy appears at the top of the stairs looking for Jack. Turns out he's been down there for quite a while, and she's worried about him. I love in this moment how Jack automatically behaves as if he's doing something he shouldn't be. Like he hides the scrapbook immediately without thinking about it, as if that's like a bad thing he's doing. And then she steps towards him and he steps back, assuming that she's trying to smell if there's alcohol on his breath, which, honestly, maybe she was. I think he assumes that. We don't see anything from her perspective, but maybe she was, right? And so we see here already the cracks in their relationship, the return to a previous modus operandi.
Yeah, I mean, he's being secretive and weird down here in the basement and has this defensive energy around him, so you can't really blame her. Mm-hmm. And once again, it's like he's reminded, oh, you just because things are good now doesn't mean you've lived this down. That doesn't mean that these mistakes are past you. She's not going to forget them. She's not going to forgive you. And you can see that it pisses him off. And you can see that their relationship starts deteriorating again. Just like the smallest thing has gone wrong.
Yeah.
And it's there's already suspicion.
Yeah, because none of the issues in the relationship that led to we're almost going to get divorced were actually solved.
Mhm.
Like I love I don't think we ever fully put that in perspective, but the idea that like Wendy was literally 2 sentences away from asking for a divorce, and he said, "Please just give me another week," and they never actually talked. They never actually had a conversation about like the state of their relationship and like what's expected out of him and her and what they're going to do to make this better. He just stopped drinking, and then we were like, okay, I guess we're good now.
Right. Better not bring it up because it would be weird.
Yeah.
That's always a good way to conduct a relationship that'll last decades.
Definitely. And then we get this. As Wendy looks at him, she says, "Your mouth is bleeding," she said in a curiously flat tone. And I love this because I kind of didn't talk about it until now, but all throughout this chapter, we've kind of seen Jack obsessively rub at his face. You know, this is established a thing he was doing a lot while he was drinking. And we knew he was doing it. The King was showing us he was doing it throughout the chapter, but I don't think we realized until this moment the extent at which he was doing it, that he was doing it so much that he's made his mouth bleed. It shows it's frankly terrifying, actually, that like this tick has come on him so much so quickly, seemingly out of nowhere, that he's rubbing it raw.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, it's funny, it reminds me of the Who Framed Roger Rabbit thing, where the Eddie Valiant is always does that mouth rubbing thing. But no, you're totally right. It's I think it's a great sort of paralleling, or I don't know if that's quite the right word exactly, but we've had this macabre interlude of reading about all this gangland violence, and now our character has, you know, blood on his mouth, literally. It's a connection of some kind.
I like that. I really love the curiously flat tone bit too. Because I think the interesting thing about this part of the chapter is that King denies us Wendy's point of view, right? Like, we're here standing with Wendy and Jack. We've been in Jack's point of view the whole chapter, and we stay there. And so we don't actually get to see what Wendy is thinking in this moment. We don't actually, like I said, we don't actually know if she was going to smell liquor on his breath. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. We don't know what she's thinking. We don't know what's going on here. We don't know what's going on in her mind as she sees his mouth is bleeding. And she probably knows it's from the rubbing of it that he did so much when he was drinking. So we don't get to see any of it, but we kind of can guess. And I love that we have to guess, because it kind of puts us in Jack's perspective a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think she understands. Well, she doesn't understand exactly what's happening, but I think she's trying really hard not to look at the problem, because she doesn't want to understand what's happening. She knows something's happening. She knows something's amiss, but she's going to look away, which is the theme of the day.
Yeah. And then we end our chapter with them going back upstairs, and King does this thing where he echoes kind of the husband-wife flirty, horny talk that we've seen in the last few chapters. The stuff that I think at the beginning of this week's reading probably played as a little cute and fun. But this one, it's different, right? It's tinged. It's tinged with the events of these chapters. It's tinged with just a little bit of darkness and anxiety and concern, isn't it? You can see both characters kind of have that reaction too, where they're playing the role of horny, flirty husband-wife, but there's something off about it.
There's a disconnection there.
Yeah.
You're right that it's performative. I mean, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it this way yet, but like you can see a marriage as a sort of narrative thing just as much as you can view a person's own story about their life as a kind of narrativization, right? Because you know, fundamentally life's just a bunch of shit that happens, right? But like we, especially us, you know, highfalutin types who like to think about stories, we tend to narrativize our own lives into the reasons why things happened and the stories of you know, why things are the way they are, or at least I do. And I don't know, maybe I should speak for myself. But I think a marriage is kind of a mutual story where you've got, you know, two players, you've got two characters in this story, and I think what you see happening here is like, well, the narrative of the marriage is what we're going to agree to continue on this narrative, even though we're both beginning to form these grave misgivings.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
All right, and that brings us to the end of the chapter. Not the end of the section, though, Matt. This is the first week that we are still technically in part 3, the Wasp's Nest. So we'll be wrapping that up next week, I think.
Okay, yeah, it's been nice, kind of cleaving things at the story, the native storylines. But
yeah,
can't always do that.
It feels like you're at an end point. No, I agree, but exactly. Didn't work. 97 pages in this one, and there's 7 more chapters to go, I think.
I wish King would write his story blocks more regularly.
Yeah, I wish King would write his story blocks in roughly 75-page sections, so it's easy to always just carve them up for our purposes.
Well, I'll let him know.
Okay. All right. But that is going to do it for reading this week. As we said, next week we will continue with part 3. We're going to be reading chapters 19 through 25. I think there's about 20 less pages than we had this week. So a little bit smaller of a reading, but still a bit to work through. We're still making our way through this book, Matt.
Great.
All right, let's move over to the discussion question. Y'all.
So we were worried we weren't going to get a lot of discussion question answers, but we did. And I guess because we asked for stories, people decided to write extremely long stories, which is fine because that's how long it takes to tell the story.
It's the basic. We should have known better. We asked Stephen King fans to write stories, and this is what we got. Just for context, we are currently on page 15 of our script. There's 21 pages in it. So that's how much y'all's stories, and just 10 of them, by the way.
Just the 10 that we picked out. And I will say I put my hand on the scale this time because the question was for ghost stories that you've experienced. At least that was my implication, or how I interpreted the question. So if you did not tell a ghost story that you experienced, I did not include your story, but appreciate your answer regardless.
Of course, I read them all. It was very fun. It took a while. A while to read them all, but I read them all.
Some may have gotten through my net, but I was aiming to include exclusively true ghost stories.
Did you put quotes on that? I heard your quotes on
what? No. No, Scott.
All right, let's go through them because they're very long. We have 6 pages worth of stuff to read, and it's already pretty late. So let's go.
Megmuffin102 says, "This is my time to shine. Come on, Matt's algorithm." Well, no, it's just me this time.
It's just Matt.
For almost 40 years, my parents owned a restaurant in a tiny village in Michigan. A la Bob's Burgers, we lived in an apartment above it. The building was built in the 1800s, and in its time was a town meeting hall, stagecoach shop, speakeasy during Prohibition, complete with secret underground passage to a still buried outback, and a whorehouse. It sat empty for many years before my parents purchased it in the early 80s. We found out after we moved in that the previous owners, Tom and Olga, had both died in the upstairs apartment that we lived in 2 weeks apart. For this reason, we always called our ghost Tom. Some of the highlights of our years there included sinks turning off and on by themselves when no one was in the building. There were swinging saloon-style doors in the kitchen leading into the dining room. They made a fairly loud noise that could be heard up in the apartment. They would start swinging wildly in the middle of the night when absolutely no one was down in the restaurant. More times than I can count, we would hear heavy footsteps coming up the stairs to the apartment, and we would open the door to see who was coming up, and no one would be there. There was one closet in the apartment that we would regularly hear loud banging and thrashing from. A rocking chair in the apartment that we could actually sit and watch start randomly rocking. Turns out the chair was there when my parents bought the place, and they kept it. None of us kids would sit in it. Many reports of customers being randomly touched or grabbed. My grandparents were staying over one weekend, and my grandpa walked out into the living area in the middle of the night to see what he thought was my dad sitting on the couch. My dad then got up, walked down the hall, and disappeared. My grandpa got his car keys and went home. Neither of my parents believed in ghosts when they first bought the place. That changed quickly. We never minded having Tom around. He was never malicious, and we all just got used to it. Sadly, since the restaurant had to close down at the start of the pandemic, my parents decided to retire and not reopen. So now the building is on the market. Tom included in the price if anyone is interested.
See, I will say for the record, I do not believe in ghosts. I don't think those are real things. And I kind of would love to live in a place like this and just be like, all right, come on,
Yeah.
let's do it.
Show me
Let's
what you got. You know, Scott, I have to tell you, this whole podcast episode, this is not a joke, by the way. This whole episode, I've been hearing weird noises upstairs. So this is really not helping my state of mind.
It's your children.
No, they're not here right now.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I think there's a non-0% chance that Tom was just a vagrant that was breaking into your parents' house.
I mean, what's funny, I love the ghost stories that end with that twist where it's like, it wasn't a ghost, it was just some guy who was living in your vents. And that's way scarier, actually.
That's better, because that means there are no ghosts. Whew.
Yeah, that's
great. All right, we have Brambino 1996 who says, when I was little, my mother and I lived with my grandfather. I remember the house we lived in being this sprawling home, the kind that a child loves and can find themselves lost in. When I saw it with the eyes of an adult, I realized it was just another house. I did have plenty of woods to explore during this stage in my childhood, though. Even as a kid, I could tell that the house was on its way down the proverbial hill. Chipping paint, a boarded-up attic, cracks in the windows. It was an old house. At some point, there had been an addition made to the home. They extended it and built a kitchen. What was once a bedroom at the back of the house became an odd rectangular hallway. This liminal room is where my grandfather slept. One night, it must have been well past midnight, I was sitting on the couch watching TV. Suddenly, I got the overwhelming feeling that something was watching me. I looked up, and standing in the doorway of my grandfather's room was the figure of a person, silhouetted by a light from the kitchen. Whatever this thing was, it was staring at me, and its eyes were glowing. I felt like this thing was angry towards me for some reason. I felt like I was frozen in place. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, willing my body to move. Finally, I did, and sprinted to my bed. I never brought this up to my family. I never saw anything like it again. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe my imagination. I don't know. But it felt real.
I love that dramatic reading, Scott. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's probably just your grandfather with weird glowy light behind him.
Yeah, maybe so. It's entirely possible. That does seem like the most likely possibility, but or maybe, yeah. I did mention my son sleepwalks, so that's always a fun curveball to throw into one's life.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Azathic says, I've lived in 2 haunted places. The house we lived in when I was in high school was a 130-year-old farmhouse at the time. Me and my dad had chronic sleep paralysis in that place. I can only speak to my experience in that regard. It would last nearly 30 minutes and happen nearly every night. Oh my God. I knew how long it would last because I would wake up and it would be 30 minutes later. During these fugues, I would see someone by my bed in a rocking chair or some sort of amorphous shimmering thing. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream for help, though I desperately wanted to. I could discount it as a medical issue, but my dad also experienced something, and I didn't find out about that until much later. Other things happened. While watching the NASCAR All-Star race of that year with my sister downstairs, we heard a crash upstairs. Her TV had been thrown off its place on her dresser. It was far enough off that it couldn't have rolled. During a time after I had gone to art school in Florida, my dad and my sister had left to Florida to visit me, leaving my mom there alone. She would recount a story of hearing someone walking around upstairs while only she and the cat Taz were in the house. She noted that Taz looked up at the noise, showing that he had heard as well. When I was there alone, I often felt uncomfortable. I had a feeling of dread while walking around outside that I eventually got used to. I could discount all of this if not for the fact that a family had moved in much later. Their son went to the school where my mom was an assistant teacher. She had heard tales of him talking about the same sleep paralysis. Speaking of Florida, my dorm down at the Art Institute was also haunted. I would often hear high-heeled footsteps on the balcony above mine and walk out to see who was there. I heard tale of sounds of pots and pans loudly rustling in a third-floor area where there was nothing but storage. The dorm was called the Sunrise Hall. It was an old reused motel. It is currently a motel as the Art Institute has stopped using it. My sleep paralysis had departed when I went to live there. I remember the black thing flying out of the vent and attacking me only to disappear one night. I can discount that as a dream. The dorm had been a well-known motel of ill repute at one point, and so the story was on campus. Or so the story was on campus. Anyway, that's my story. Thank you for reading it.
That's scary.
That is scary.
I don't like it.
I am worried about the level of carbon monoxide in the house where you and your dad both experienced sleep paralysis. So I would want to check that out specifically.
Can that cause sleep paralysis? I didn't know that.
Well, it can cause hallucinations. It can cause headaches. It can cause dizziness. It can cause a lot of the things that are normally associated with ghost sightings. And I don't know that it can cause sleep paralysis, but I would bet that it screws up your sleep. That's just a guess, though.
Interesting. It's scary. I don't know when our podcast turned into the no sleep Reddit.
It's probably when we asked for a bunch of ghost stories.
Touche. All right, next we have Coach Wargo, who says, I've always believed in ghosts, but only once have I ever actually seen one. When I was in college, I dated a girl who lived with her dad and her grandparents. When I would go to her place, we would hang out in the basement and watch movies, make out, etc. Quite often, I would get the feeling that I was being watched, like there was someone at the top of the stairs, even though the door was closed. Yeah, that was just them spying on you to make sure you weren't doing the etc.
Yeah.
One night, we were sitting in the kitchen talking when I saw a woman come out of a bedroom, walk down the hall, and enter the bathroom. I said to her, I thought everyone else was out for the night. She said, yes, they are. Well, I just saw someone in the hall. Oh, that's just my aunt. So we're not alone? We are. She passed away a few years ago, but sometimes she still wanders around the house and checks up on me. Not everyone can see her. My mom can, but my dad can't. I found that last bit interesting because it was her dad, not her mom, who was the blood relative to the aunt, and yet he had never seen her spirit. At any rate, I also think my girlfriend's aunt was looking in on those times we were being watched in the basement. Yeah, watching you make out.
That's I like how the phrasing is. I found that interesting. I'm like, yeah, I would find that interesting.
I would find that terrifying.
Interesting that I just saw. I'm just imagining seeing a ghost and being like, oh yeah, that's just the ghost. That's just my dead aunt. Oh, well, cool.
I think this is the difference between people who just like believe in ghosts and people like you and I who don't, right? Like to a person who believes in ghosts, seeing a ghost is just like, oh yeah, if you're not hurting me, that's fine. But like, if I saw a ghost, I would be like, what the fuck? I don't believe that thing exists. And yet here we are. So.
Yeah. Right. It is really interesting. I mean, I don't want to, trash anybody's deeply held beliefs because it's not, I don't want to do that. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or any of that. But like the power of suggestion is incredibly powerful. Like you can, if you expect to see something, you can like if you go to one of these like famous haunted houses, the odds are drastically higher that you'll see something weird because you're in a sense auto hypnotizing yourself, much like Danny Torrance in his Shining, right? You're persuading yourself that you're gonna see something, and then your senses will find something, right?
Sure.
Anyway,
yeah. The brain is a very, very powerful thing.
It really, really is. The Walking Hard case says, when I was in the Army, I was briefly stationed in Germany. My mom came to visit. One day we grabbed lunch and decided to eat it under a bridge. We barely started when I started to get a really strange feeling. Hair standing on end, kind of a pit in my stomach, then a shiver down my back. I looked over at my mom. She had these wide eyes and even seemed to be tearing up. Then she said something to the effect of, let's go. So we gathered up our stuff and walked and ate. We stopped in a little shop a while later. The owner spoke English, so we asked him if there was anything up with that bridge. As soon as we asked, the guy's face dropped. He then explained that had been the spot where a lot of Jews had been loaded onto train cars and also executed. Apparently lots of folks had similar experiences because we weren't the first who'd found their way into his shop and asked about the bridge. I've only had a few other instances over the years, nothing to make me believe anything one way or the other, but enough to feel confident that there's something beyond this brief mortal life. Love that.
That's yeah, I like that a lot too.
It's a great story. I
wonder, like, spirits or ghosts aside, if there's just like, I don't know, something immeasurable that gets imprinted on places.
Yeah, energy.
Yeah.
I do have to say, despite the fact that I think you and I are on the same page and like not believing in it, I kind of want to believe in it.
Oh, I would. I wouldn't love it because it'd be really scary, but I maybe I'd kind of love it.
Yeah, it would be something.
Sure would. All right. Walking Dude 22 says haunted houses. I have. My parents owned a house in Florida for most of the 80s and 90s. The house was smallish and run down. In the evenings, while children were going to bed, the whole family was entertained by the spirits pacing up and down the hallway. In another of our houses, wet spots shaped like people would inexplicably appear on the living room wall. I hope you got your pipes checked. I also have a few years of hospitality experience under my belt. Nobody ever died at my hotel. We did occasionally have people trying very hard. Once, once while I was the night auditor, we had a woman try to commit. Oh, I laughed at that.
Oh,
And
okay, that's not actually funny. Sorry.
I didn't realize he was talking about suicide.
Yeah,
Yeah,
me neither.
we had a woman try to commit suicide by cutting her wrists. Some of her friends were worried about her because her phone line was busy and no one answered when I knocked on the door. I, as a young man and a sole employee on the property, was not going to use my key to enter her guest room. I called the police out to do a wellness check. She lived and we blacklisted her. The room was a mess. That was a Friday night and my boss wouldn't come in because he was a Seventh-day Adventist. He said, lock the room, we'll clean it on Monday. That room was never right again. It always had an unpleasant owner. The stain wouldn't come out of the mattress or the carpet. They changed the room from a double to a single and put one bed on top of the stained carpet. From then on, I never put anyone else in there, but sometimes it would rent early in the day. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of reminiscent of the previous one where it's not a ghost per se, but a sort of darkness that stays. And it happens to be a hotel. So I guess that makes it super appropriate.
Yeah.
For the context. Although, really quite a sad story, though.
Definitely.
All right. Coscat7594 says, so my wife is very empathic and sensitive to the paranormal. It's a common thing with the women in her family. In October of 21, my wife was 8 months pregnant with our daughter, and we were living in a house my family had been in for about 200 years. Wow. For weeks, she had been waking up at around 4 or so in the morning and not be able to sleep. She kept having the feeling of being watched. One morning in late October, this happened, and we went downstairs, went outside so I could smoke a cigarette before we went back to sleep. So it was pretty much the routine at this point. As it is with pregnant women, she pretty much had to hit the bathroom anytime we went back to the bedroom. So for some reason, we decided not to go back to bed this day and have a coffee to start the day early. This morning happened to be the day of a particularly bad nor'easter. Before the coffee had even finished brewing, the large hawthorn tree in our front yard was hit by what is known as a bomb cyclone, and it fell on our house. The bathroom that she goes to on the way to our bedroom had a beam go through the wall to exactly where her head would have been if we had done the normal routine that day instead of staying up. We were pretty convinced that my ancestors were trying to warn us of this. I know this isn't necessarily the kind of ghost story you had in mind, but it seemed the most relevant. Also, this happened 5 days before her scheduled C-section.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's cool to include this because it's like a different kind of paranormal thing that honestly, I would say to the extent that I have ever experienced anything weird, it's more like this kind of thing where something just really unlikely and fortunate happens where you're like, wow, somebody's watching out for me, you know?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it feels like there's so much random, horribleness in the world sometimes when that level of kismet happens. It's just like there's got to be something watching out.
Yeah,
I agree. So we have Ruiz MD who says, first, let me say I never saw anything. How's that for an opening line? I'm in higher education, and I began my career as an assistant professor at a small private university in Indiana. I had moved from Minnesota to begin my duties at my new job, but my wife, pregnant with our first of 3, remained at our house 10 hours away in Minnesota, where I had attended graduate school. So with no one around, I spent a lot of time at work in my new office late into the night. My office was located on the building which housed the gyms, weight rooms, etc. To get to my office, you'd go up the stairs, turn right, go down a long hallway, turn left, then turn left again. Not a maze, but you couldn't look out my office door and see down the long hallway. On several occasions, I would be in my office after midnight. The first thing I heard was the fire door, which was supposed to stay open, close. I'd go back out and open it up again. No big deal. Maybe an hour later, the door might close again, and then I'd hear the sound of footsteps running down the hall. Once, I heard female laughter. I didn't think much of it because this was a university after all, and people wander in and out of buildings all the time. Sometimes when I would hear the running down the hall, I might pop out of my office to see who was there, only to find the corridor empty and the fire door closed. More than once, I felt a cold chill while walking down the long hallway. I was new here, so I didn't think a lot of it. Sometime later, I was in the classroom whose sides were boarded on my office. It was late at night, and a buddy and I were watching the World Series on the big projector screen. Friends, something started walking in on the tiled ceiling above us, literally stepping on the tiles from above. Could have been the world's largest mouse? Sure, if it took one step at a time like a person does. The steps took one passed from back of the room to the front. That freaked us out a bit. As I spent more time at the university, I started hearing stories from the others about doors closing, unexplained wind blowing down the hall, etc., but only in this particular building. As far as I know, no one actually saw anything ghostly, just sounds. I eventually heard some stories that the building had been built on some old ruins, and that it was in the National Registry of Haunted Places. I cannot confirm either. I also cannot explain it.
Creepy. For some
Very
reason,
creepy.
that's just as creepy as any of the others to me. For some reason, it's like just the idea of just a weird, creepy place with weird things that happen and doors that shut, and it's a poltergeist.
Also, even if it's no ghost stuff at all, and it's just like people wandering around this empty building at night, that's also still kind of creepy.
That's true. Interesting. A lot of this stuff, it's like why hotels are creepy, because you'll hear sounds all around you, and you don't know. I mean, you know it's people because it's a hotel, but you don't really know who or what or why. So.
Yeah, and like the thing, like most of the time, like the sounds of your house are just things that fade into the background, and you don't even consciously recognize them anymore because they're just the sounds of your life. But when you go to a hotel, it's like you're in a place doing the same things you do at home, sleeping, sitting in bed, watching TV, that kind of stuff. But you're in a place where none of those sounds are backgrounded anymore. They're all foregrounded for you. And so it's just immediately creepier.
That's exactly right. Yep. All right, Complicated 9519 says, I can't say I've ever seen a ghost, but I've definitely had experiences. One house I lived in when I was in high school, every time I went to bed, I felt like someone was standing at the edge of the bed just staring at me. I'd sleep with the TV on, but it got so bad I started sleeping on the couch downstairs for over a year. The same house, I had family members say they'd wake up to their door being cracked open and a figure just staring at them. Oh, Jesus Christ. But I think just sleep with your door open. You guys are freaking me out. But I think one place that really gave me haunted vibes was the fraternity house I lived in during college. It was a 3-floor house with tons of room. We'd have meetings. We'd have a meeting 3 times a week to discuss the upcoming events and plans. And the room we used was right off the entrance of the house. We'd have the door closed to the room, and occasionally it would either crack open or was not closed, and you'd see shadows. It would look like someone walked into the house and down the hall with no sound of the front door opening. People would run out of the room to see who came in the house to find no one. Sometimes when the house was empty, aside from a couple of people, you'd hear footsteps pounding down the hall or in the room above you. You'd go to check it out and ask if anyone was on the floor and confront people later asking if they were in their room at said time, only for them to say they were at classes. Things would disappear. But when you live in a house with 20 plus dudes, it's hard to say that's paranormal. Some guy lost a whole load of laundry, yet it's still yet to be found by anyone. Occasionally at the house I live in now, if you're using the bathroom, the door will creak open and slam shut instantly. But as skeptics, you can take these small stories with a grain of salt. One last thing is like to add is these girls have a podcast called Two Girls, One Ghost. So if you like the paranormal, definitely check them out. They did an episode on hotels where one of the girls gets even covered the Stanley Hotel. It was one of their first episodes, and I do think they got some stuff wrong, but still interesting. One or both of the girls also stayed there, saying that they didn't get to experience anything paranormal to their dismay.
Yeah, I stayed at the Stanley as well, and I did the ghost tour and all that stuff, and I saw and experienced absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It is cool though. Like, as you were saying, like the power of suggestion, right? Like I am right now, as we sit here recording this podcast, strongly feeling like someone is watching me. And it's just because we're talking about people watching people. And my brain has decided that that's what it's going to feel. I've never felt that experience in this room before, but I'm feeling it right this minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry to say that's probably all it is. There's probably not a ghost in your house, but be careful.
Look, we don't know. We don't know.
It's true.
Could be a ghost in your house.
Could be a ghost.
Last but not least, we have Sugar Chilali. Did I say that right?
I don't know.
Sugar Chilali. My haunted story takes place on a haunted property that includes a hotel. I was at a bachelorette party hopping the bars on the haunted property. I have never seen any ghost there despite its highly publicized reputation for ghosties. A cousin of the bride worked there, and she was giving us a tour. We entered a stairwell, and there above me on the stairs was this person-shaped shadow not attached to a person. Not cool. I was mostly sober, not amused, and practically choked trying to play it cool. Feelings and premonitions are one thing, but shadows that look solid and feel like death are another. The cousin was just babbling on about the history of the building, and I was staring out trying to remember the Lord's Prayer. I got lost somewhere after "Hallowed be thy name" and was just babbling in my head desperately. I'm sure the big guy got my intention, but perhaps he was distracted by someone making a poor choice in the parking lot, leaving me staring at the thing. It had no eyes and such couldn't stare back at me for like 2 minutes. Until, miracle of miracles, my friend started pushing me from behind and saying, "We need out of here," like she just saw an ex who wouldn't stop texting her. When we got out, I turned around and asked her super casually in a hiss that I am sure everyone for half a mile heard, "Did you see that curse wording thing?" She said, "I didn't see anything, but that place just felt bad." Fair enough. She might have just felt me vibrating, but all right. I brushed it off with some mystic witchy BS I don't remember now. Probably something about ghosts that we'd all heard about a thousand times. The moment passed, and we moved on to the next bar and the next very necessary serving of alcohol. I have spent the last 28 years staying away from that stairwell, even though nothing I can keep me from the Cajun tots they serve at the bar. No reason to take chances with shadowy death by using that particular exit. As much as I'd like to tell you I grew up and now think I was just taking in the atmosphere and all the stories I heard and being dramatic, I just can't. I heard the stories, stairwells are kind of creepy, and I certainly was dramatic at 23. It doesn't matter. That shadow thing was there, and I see no reason to see if it still is or not.
I think just
That's
to be
a great
safe,
story.
I'm going to take to carrying around a pouch of salt with me at all times and just use that in situations like this.
To season your food?
No, Scott, don't you remember the rules and pact and all that stuff? You gotta the spirits can't cross a line of salt, or you can draw a line of salt around them in a circle with salt and they can't cross it and all that.
It feels made up to me.
Or about yourself. Well, it's all made up, and if it's all the power of suggestion anyway, then you might as well carry the salt, right?
Where am I gonna carry a thing of salt?
Well, you want to get like a big bag of it, and you want to kind of hitch it to your belt so it's on the outside and really visible.
Oh, this is great. Everyone's gonna love me, the salt guy.
Yeah.
And then anytime I get scared or concerned or anxious about anything, I'm just gonna throw salt. People would love me.
Good if you were just totally normal and straight laced in every way, except you have the salt bag. And if people ask you about it, you're just very frank and you're just like, "Yeah, it's for ghosts.
It's for the ghosts."
Yeah. Have you ever seen one? No. And that's, because I have the salt bag, they stay away.
Imagine going to work in a new office and you're just like walking through the hall one day and you just see me with a bag of salt pouring a circle around me.
Uh-huh.
And you go to your coworker and it's like, "What the fuck is going on with Scott?" It's like, "Oh, he's just the salt guy."
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
You get used to it.
He'll pick it up after he's done.
At least you don't have to worry about ghosts in this workplace.
I guess, yeah. He's only putting the circle around his direct self, not the whole workplace.
That's true.
I don't have enough salt for that. No, those were wonderful stories. Thank you for spooking me out a little bit, everyone. I hope we didn't make you feel like we were belittling you or anything. I just flat out don't believe in that stuff. But it's really cool hearing your experiences, nonetheless.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely believe you experienced the things you say you experienced. I just don't necessarily think it was magic, but that's okay.
All right. Matt, would you read next week's discussion question for us?
Next week's question is, what is your favorite use of wasps, bees, or stinging insects in storytelling? And Scott added a parenthetical, if you picked my girl, you are a bad person and I don't like you.
Do you know what I'm referencing there?
I do. But I don't see why that's a bad pick. That's okay.
It's so sad.
I guess you're not allowed to pick my girl. Poor Macaulay Culkin.
You can pick my girl. I think that I was 6 when that movie came out. I think that was one of my first experiences with death, and I did not do well with it.
Okay. I saw when I was much older, and it didn't affect me as much, but that was because I had seen a million movies by then.
You're a monster. So.
I guess so. I'm sorry.
Yeah. He needs his glasses.
He can't see without his glasses.
Can't see without his glasses. Okay, anyway, that is it for us here on Kingslingers. Next week, The Shining will continue with chapters 19 through 25, and we'll get to talk about some great insect questions. And I'm sure one of you is going to pick my girl, so we'll have to do that too.
Yep, that's right. Remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com, or over on Twitter at kingslingerspod, or over on the subreddit at r/doofmedia.
And if you're not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we strongly recommend you do so and never miss an episode. You can find us at all the different places. And Matt, I think let's folks, if you use Instagram, which I think you do because I think everyone uses Instagram, you should go follow us there, because we're spending some time and committing to posting more on that thing now, and not just, hey, there's a new episode, but other stuff too.
That's right. I don't use Instagram, but yeah, all of you.
Matt, you're doing a terrible job of selling it.
No, it's great. It's going to be great. And if you like any of our shows here on the Doof Network and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia to support me and Scott. Special thanks to new patrons: Dr. Gus, Dieter P., Zanish, Paul H., Cass, and Joshua. Welcome back. I think I recognize some of those names. We hope you like the cool stuff we have over there and all of the Stephen King bonus content.
Yeah, I don't think Patreon lets us know if it's a person that unsubbed and then resubbed later.
Yeah.
So they all just come as new people. So you get another shout out. Congratulations.
Yeah. Right.
Of course, if you cannot afford to donate to us, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing the podcast. Lots of people have been doing it, especially with those wonderful Instagram posts that I see you folks sharing. Please keep it up. Thank you so much for doing that. And of course, you can always help us by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that lets you do that. This week's spotlight review comes from B Brown 718, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Season 3 is here. I love the show and look forward to it in my feed every week." That was short and sweet, B Brown, but we really appreciate it. That was so nice. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who takes the time to send in those rating and reviews. I say it every week, but they really do help and they mean a lot to us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, folks, that is it for us. Thank you for all your spooky stories, the ones that we read on the air and the ones that I just read alone in bed late at night. We appreciate it. We will see you all next week. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.